Hello, and welcome to the third in a four-part series on the development of queer theory. My name is Max Reynolds, and I'm the author of The Revolutionary Renaissance, a study on the dialectical evolution of totalitarian thought. You can find my book on Amazon, and more of my work available on my website, maxoreynolds.com. Whilst this is called Lecture 3, much of this lecture will actually be reading through the contents of the works of dialectical philosophers or academics who are working in the area of queer theory and gender studies. So this part is really examining how the ideas of Foucault unfold in the wider academic literature, how his key premises are expanded into different areas, and then the consequences of that. So what we will see is the creation of categories which are now antagonistic with regards to sex and sexuality as you would understand them. We can also see the development of a queer criminology and discourses on pederasty, so this is minor attracted persons. We can also see how queer is then read into pedagogy, so how teaching needs to be queered explicitly and how new queer discourses can create queer subjects. And lastly, we can see one other manifestation of queer pedagogy, which is Drag Queen Story Hour. And this is a means of teaching children, but where the teacher is a drag artist. So adult shows for children. To have a quick recap, in Foucault's philosophy, sex is a discourse. And so it's the product of an old society, an old set of relations. It is imbibed with the consequences of an old ideology, and of course he wants to depose these. So he situates the world and the way we understand it as a series of discourses, and these discourses can either be populated with the contents which are a theme. These are the old things that need to be removed, negated, done away with, overthrown, inverted, and instead new theories put into their place. So a discourse has its old form, and then it adopts a new form on adoption by the theories. So we see here that sex, previously linked to biology, psychiatry, and it has this very material basis where sexuality is contingent on sex. We see this relationship inverted, so that as Foucault describes, there's a castration occurs, sexuality is no longer contingent on sex. And one of the key things that he would like to do when he removes things like laws which restrict perversions is he would simply like the people who have whatever sexual orientation or sexuality, whatever kind of perversion, to be able to negotiate the power relation between them, so whether or not the perversion can take place and in what way it takes place. Now, of course, when we recall Foucault's problems, his pederasty, his notions of child consent, it's quite easy to see where some of these ideas lead and precisely what they are motivated by. It's not just academic inquiry. There is really a personal motive here for Foucault, and it's no surprise that a particularly intelligent person who is that way inclined is capable of constructing a philosophy which explores their ideas and which gains them access to children through one means or another. So one of the key things to recognise in Foucault is that he is the originator of queer theory, this idea of getting rid of the illicit, overturning the laws which restrict perversions. This is quite clearly a means of reintegrating old contradictions from society. So the contradiction was the thing which was excluded, the thing which is apparently dominated and has force applied to it. That is obviously problematic within the Marxist genealogy when ultimately you want to integrate. And so you obviously reject the laws as they were, reject the rejection of the perversions, reintegrate the perversions, and reform a new sexual society. So, of course, framing law as a discourse helps in that endeavour because it's simply a power relation. It doesn't matter that somebody else has established their system of sexuality, their system of law. It's just a power game, and so there's no justification as to why you shouldn't be able to do yours. In spite of this logic, they don't tend to see it as being applicable to themselves in the sense that their use of force is no better than the other. It's not really about achieving kind of a more equanimity between different groups. It's actually, when it comes to the Marxist system, all about force, all about dominion. And so really whenever you accuse someone else of force or dominion or power or oppression, it's actually simply so that you can invert the relationship, so you can redistribute power and oppression to the right group, not to dispense with it wholly. So, of course, now it's time to really move on to some of the ideas which have developed after Foucault. So from 1969, when Foucault initially published his History of Sexuality, Volume 1, he himself conducted a number of further studies, Volumes 2 to 3, I believe there might be a fourth one, and his ideas were taken up most immediately by two people, Gayle, Rubin and Judith Butler, but his work is referenced quite widely throughout the literature, and we will see how his ideas are basically taken and then expanded upon. The consequences of Foucault's initial work are basically broadened out and applied into different sociological areas and have different consequences for identity and society. But there's clear recognition throughout all of these that this is fundamentally a political project, just like how Foucault said that he wasn't going to instruct politics, he was going to instruct a sense of truth from which politics would emerge. That sense of truth is, of course, nested within a discourse in which lived experience produces the content. So basically, lived experience produces the source of truth and then the politics. Now, just as in the 1917 revolution, when it was the women's workers who went out and were joined by many of the other revolutionaries, here it's once again feminists who are leading the charge. And what we see in Gayle Rubin's Thinking Sex is the integration of the thought of Foucault into the existing feminist literature. And this is going to produce some interesting consequences, because naturally where you dispense with the idea that sexuality is contingent on sex, then you're going to end up divorcing the idea of sexuality and the various manifestations people can have of their sexuality from its biological base. So you would think that this is harmful to woman or is anti-woman, and yes, essentially once you dispense with the biological categories of sex, then you're left with linguistic games and arbitrary choice. So in Thinking Sex, we see Gayle Rubin say, "I'm now arguing that it is essential to separate gender and sexuality analytically to reflect more accurately their separate social existence." And so the thing to recognise here is that feminists had mainly been looking at things from the perspective of gender. So there was man and woman, and within the rough feminist framework, not too different from the ideas of Engels, we see that man oppresses woman and it's inherently cruel. And then sexuality is more of the Foucauldian aspect here. And so there's kind of almost a distinction about two discourses occurring. Sexuality being the more Foucauldian rejection of the illicit. And so this is the more legal aspect of the discourse subtly coming in, although it's not necessarily referred to in the legal sense. So one of the things she states is, "The law is especially ferocious in maintaining the boundary between childhood innocence and adult sexuality. Rather than recognizing the sexuality of the young and attempting to provide for it in a caring and responsible manner, our culture denies and punishes erotic interest and activity by anyone under the local age of consent. The amount of law devoted to protecting young people from premature exposure to sexuality is breathtaking." End quote. So quite clearly we can see that Gayle Rubin is, like Foucault, railing against the legal controls on what would have been termed perversions in Foucault. Here we're talking about the prevention of adults having erotic interest in children under the age of consent. So there is actually still a notion of consent here. Perhaps if the ideas of consent are shared with Foucault, that local age could go incredibly low. The amount of law is seen as a problem, and of course where law is a discourse which reflects a certain collective's relation to the material world, then through which power is exerted on people and through which people then recapitulate the same discourse, that same process of power generation and the same process of controlling and constituting identity. Where it's arbitrary, then there's no reason for it not to be overthrown. And of course, what we're seeing here is that maintaining the boundary between childhood and adult sexuality is now a problem. This, of course, is prefigured in much of Foucault's ideas. We can understand why. But what we're seeing is how when you have one discourse and it is related to other discourses, so the series of discursive relations, when you break apart one discourse as it previously existed and attempt to replace it with new strategies, new theories within those discourses, then you have effects go wider than the immediate realm. This actually begins most likely in the philosophy of Derrida, but I'm not going to go into his philosophy specifically in this lecture series. It's simply sufficient to say that once you start to eliminate or remove the discourses which have previously existed around sexuality, then things such as childhood innocence as a discourse also need to be reformed. And Gayle Rubin here is saying that explicitly. So when it comes to the aspects of sexuality and Foucault's ideas, we obviously see these now being picked up by some subset of feminists who are interested in the more Foucauldian approach, which is the exclusion of certain behaviours, perversions, and then obviously their reintegration. So we see Rubin making statements like, boy lovers are so stigmatized that it is difficult to find defenders for their civil liberties, their erotic orientation. So here what we're seeing is the rejection that pederasty ought to be stigmatized, and that people should and decrying the fact that there's not enough effort for their civil liberties. Is called an erotic orientation. Now, of course, right beside the quote above, which I've selected there, when you're considering erotic interest in children by adults and the erotic orientation of so-called boy lovers and their stigmatization being a problem, we can see quite clearly how these ideas, if you're going to start rejecting those who have been rejected by society, if you're going to start rejecting the legal controls, if you're going to start rejecting the perversions that have been labelled illicit, then that's going to lead to social consequences in which children are abused. But nonetheless, Gayle Rubin presses on. And so she also bemoans how a lecturer at a university in the 1970s was sacked for putting on an art display in which her prepubescent son was masturbating. And so, this is really the quality of scholarship we're going to go from here. So this kind of sets the tone, and it doesn't really get any better. I just want to be realistic with this. And so when Gayle Rubin then says that sex law is the most adamantine instrument of sexual stratification and erotic persecution, it's quite clearly easy to see how all of these come together and reflect Foucault's initial criticism of society and law as it currently exists, and indeed describe some of these other sexual practices as akin to a spicy cuisine. It's nothing more consequential than a type of food. We can see essentially how all of the ideas in Foucault are already present and recapitulated here. But importantly, it's the integration of Foucault's thought into existing feminist thought. And from here, we're going to see quite a considerable change in the way that feminism will progress. So traditionally, we would have heard of feminists advocating for the ability to go out and work, so that if they weren't in wedlock, then they would have the ability to go out and earn a living for themselves, provide for themselves, have a bit of their own life, and then and could support themselves without having to rely on a man. So this is really the gaining of agency. This is being able to provide for yourself and to have your own income. It's to pursue your own vocations and trades and interests. And in contrast to that, now what we'll see is the Foucauldian approach. And the Foucauldian approach will, as we've quite clearly seen, look at the perversions and use those as the source of new sources of truth and then new sources of political transformation. And so it's really in this kind of era where you'll start to, instead of hearing things like, well, prostitution is inherently bad, prostitution is a labour exploitation of woman by the patriarchal man, will instead start to begin the shift towards seeing that prostitution is something positive. So this is the integration, the removal of contradictions in the pursuit of something new. Is you take the thing which is excluded, the ejector from society, you dialectically reform it, you create and extract the new knowledge from it, the lived experience of those people, and you use this lived experience as a juxtaposition against the existing society in an effort to overturn the norms of the existing society. Now, sexuality and Foucault's developments are already very well attuned to this, but this is one of the key documents we'll see before this stuff really takes off. So the next person to look at was Sandy Stone, and they wrote a piece called A Post-Transsexual Manifesto in 1987, and Stone is saying that, quote, I read Raymond to be claiming that transsexuals are constructs of an evil phallocentric empire and were designed to invade women's spaces and appropriate women's power. So this is back in 1987, quite long before, any of the modern, our present day concerns and the social manifestation of queer theory and gender ideology. And what we can see is that feminists, that break between feminists of the old order and then feminists of the Foucauldian school and the integration of Foucault's ideas into feminism. And so there was recognition by feminists at the time that transsexuals were, at least in their view, just yet another manifestation of the oppressive evil phallocentrism, the evil masculinity, which has, forever and always dominated women, and that this was just another ruse in order to further expand on that domination, to further, exert power on women by, parading in front of them that you could even go into their spaces, take away from them their privacy and their dignity. But in contradiction to this, Stone states that representation at its most magical, the transsexual body is perfected memory inscribed with a true story of Adam and Eve as the ontological account of irreducible difference, an essential biography which is part of nature. A story which culture tells itself, the transsexual body is a tactile politics of reproduction constituted through textual violence. Now that's going to sound like a hell of a mouthful, so we're going to need to break that down a bit. One of the things which is quite key in Jacques Derrida's philosophy is the association between representer and the thing which is represented, so signifier and signified. And in Derrida's philosophy, what you do is you separate the existing attachment between signifier and signified. So a word, for example, has a meaning which we're familiar with, and you break apart the word from its original meaning, and then you might apply something like a division of labour in the realm of language to then say this meaning has been populated with the ideas of people who are under the system of labour, who have got the wrong ideas, they're idealists, they're speculative, they're philosophers, they've got the wrong relation to nature. Instead, you need this new meaning for the word, which is populated, which is more materialist, which is the correct relation to reality. And then you use this, so you can have split language, singular word, but you've got, depending on which society you're a part of, whether you're the bourgeoisie or whether you're the subaltern revolutionary classes, you'll actually have different meanings attached to the same word. So at this point, after Derrida's deconstruction, people are incapable of talking and communicating effectively to one another. So it's caustic, it destroys democracy at the fundamental level, because you at a certain point are no longer capable on any level of engaging with people who have a different political affiliation from yourself. So what's being got at here is that representation of the transsexual body is the perfected memory. And so it's being referenced here is the story of Adam and Eve. God makes Eve from one of Adam's ribs. And so the idea there is that there is there's a hermaphrodism in the initial human, and it's this which is being used by Stone. So the most perfect representation is that the transsexualism goes and bypasses the sexual dimorphism of Adam and Eve to the pre-dimorphism stage, in which there was a unitary one. And so we're seeing a very different kind of categorization and understanding of what it means to be a being. So when it's stated as the ontological account of irreducible difference, we're saying that now the characteristic of bodily being is at a point of irreducible difference. You don't go at any point prior to Adam. There's no human prior to Adam, but the premise is that Adam in his original state had Eve within him. So there's the dual nature of humanity already ensconced within Adam, and that's part of our nature. So, of course, if that's part of our nature, you can kind of see this idea of perfected memory. So the return to the original nature is undoing all of the contradictions which have occurred later after Adam and Eve. And so we have and where the transsexual body is a tactile politics of reproduction constituted through textual violence, what we're seeing here is how a certain discourse violently or exerts itself in such a way that people are reproduced, and that this is a certain violence on people. So you can even have the notion that, for example, if the prevailing discourse asserts that there is an Adam and Eve, if the prevailing discourse asserts that there is sexual dimorphism, then you actually have a form of violence taking place. And the ideal, or the preferred rather, ideal actually has a specific technical meaning with regards to Hegelian philosophy. So the preference really is to move back to the unitary form of Adam, which is being used here to argue a kind of hermaphrodism. Now, of course, this goes against biblical scripture. Adam wasn't man plus woman, but woman was made from the material taken from man by God. So this is obviously against scripture. Not that that's going to prevent any neo-Marxists or post-structuralists. But the idea is still to undo the knowledge, the discourses, the contents of this discourses, so the strategy, and the strategy specifically the theme, to undo the old theme strategies and to establish new theory strategies. And one of those is, of course, following on through the Gramscian and Foucauldian vein, is to reject the knowledge as it previously exists. And so what we're going to see is the rejection of, for example, medical terminology, which is starting to, or which maintains the distinctions between male and female, and which rejects the ability to interchange arbitrarily. And so what's quite clear in Stone's work is that, this is really a third category. So we're typically used to understanding things through the lens of sexual dimorphism. There's a man, there is a woman, there's the male sex, there's the female sex, and then up from that is their sexuality. But their sexuality is nonetheless restricted somewhat by their sex, and there are peculiarities to each of the sexes because of their biology, because of the endocrine systems of both of the sexes, because of the way that DNA and mitochondria are passed on to the children through the process of spermatoza uniting with ovum. And so there's very distinct roles which are biologically recognized. This is attempting to move into a new area of something which is very arbitrary. And so with this new category, this new area which has been, or this new discursive form which has been established, it then needs contents. And whilst you can say that, well, you need strategies and things as contents of the discursive aspect, those contents likewise need to come from lived experience. You need people who are going to populate those discourses. And so we obviously come to the quote that the genre of visible transsexuals must grow by recruiting members from the class of invisible ones. So there's the notion here that some people are already transsexuals and occupy that new category, but that number of people in the new category is quite small. And so the requirement is to take people from existing categories, so the sexually dimorphic, man and woman, and to then come into the new third category, the transsexual. And furthermore, that this process should be deliberate, so it's encouraged, there's a goal behind it, there is a motive. And of course, when we come back to Foucault's ideas, we're thinking about the class consciousness with regards to sexuality, so the overthrow of the old sexual order, which includes the restriction of perversions, but also now sexual dimorphism, because it rejects the fact that sexuality is contingent on sex. So, quote, we must begin to re-articulate the foundational language by which both sexuality and transsexuality are described. And here we can quite clearly see how, very explicitly after Foucault, but this was also the case right in Marx when he'd translated Aristotle's rhetoric quite early in his career, how it's really the linguistic descriptions which are used to shape the way that shape people's consciousness, their emotional reactions to the world around them, the semantic knowledge they have of the world, and obviously the meaning of that knowledge of the world for them, which is in turn attached to their emotional experiences of the world. So here, change language and change sexuality, you can see the distinction between strategy old, strategy theme, and strategy theory in the future. And obviously here it's quite clear that transsexuality is being described as one of those future ones. So this is really fundamentally a Foucauldian exploration. It's got all of the aspects of the discourses and removing sexuality as being contingent on sex, recognizing a lot of the old feminist concerns, but seeking to go beyond them nonetheless. Now, the next person to come to is Judith Butler, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, 1990. So at the start of this lecture series, I mentioned, or I had a question in which I asked, what if there was a project to subvert identity, and what if queer theory and gender ideology were related to this project to subvert identity? And here we have the answer. So yes, there is a project to subvert identity. And yes, when we come to Foucault's thought, and then how Foucault's thought is taken, understood, applied and developed by other academics, we can quite clearly see how you're going to subvert the notion of identity. You're going to subvert the ideas that people use to talk about sex and sexuality. You're going to subvert the knowledge and the scientific ideas surrounding those same concepts. So Judith Butler states, this text continues then as an effort to think through the possibility of subverting and displacing those naturalized and reified notions of gender that support masculine hegemony and heterosexist power, to make gender trouble, not through the strategies that figure a utopian beyond, but through a mobilization, subversive confusion and proliferation of precisely those constitutive categories that seek to keep gender in its place by posturing as the foundational illusions of identity. So Judith Butler is fairly reputed for having an obtuse style. in the same camp really as Derrida and Marx, and particularly Hegel. But really what's being said here is that there is now an effort to take Foucault's thought and to make sure that the intellectual framework around it is really being developed and understood and applied. And so the ideas of Foucault and feminists, now these post-feminists, as they should be described, because it's not feminism, they're actually going beyond the notion of a female sexuality tied to the feminine sex, the female sex. They're going beyond this, they're going into something else. And so here the naturalized and reified notions of gender are the different sexes, and even the manifestations of sexuality which are tied to them. And so the old understanding which we would have, where sexuality is contingent on sex, would be part of this masculine hegemony. Apparently it's all just a linguistic game which is used to essentially assert and maintain heterosexist power. So that's, on the one hand, the power of the man over the woman, but at the same time it's the power of the heterosexual over the homosexual. So we're starting to see, in complement to Gayle Rubin's ideas, not only the male-female dimension, but then the hetero and homo dimension. And these are all coming together now, where we have gender and queer essentially coming together. These are now inherently linked. They haven't necessarily been labelled explicitly as queer theory, and but although gender is quite clearly explicit, but queer theory hasn't quite been named openly yet, although it really finds its roots, as we've seen in Foucault, with the inability to reject certain practices. So of course this isn't to then or this is rather to create gender trouble. So if in the modern day you feel that there is perhaps gender trouble taking place, then this would be a good text to look at. If you think that gender trouble is starting to cause some problems in society, politically particularly in the political landscape, then this is obviously a key text laying out part of that project when you're subverting identity. And so the strategies are not looking for the utopian beyond. So this is a reference to Marxist humanism. But instead of going for a kind of a Marxist humanism in where you would still have a proletarian and then a communist and socialist form of the family, now it's actually a subversive confusion. So you're deliberately looking to distort and to break conventional understanding and practices, and then use this to undo the existing order, and to change the conceptions that people have of identity. So where, for example, Foucault has his discourses, which are verbal praxes, there's still the practical aspect of the way that people actually conduct themselves. And so whilst Foucault has developed the philosophical aspect, so if we go back to Gramsci's philosophy of praxis, Foucault's developing the new philosophical frameworks, the philosophy which is going to guide the new set of praxes as we go forward. On the one hand verbal, on the one hand practical, but he's opened up a new space by situating everything as a discourse, and that now you can have a verbal and a practical manifestation under these new discourses, and the new discourses here are of course to displace the sexual dimorphism. So likewise we also have some of the ideas of Deborah Britzman. So is there a queer pedagogy? It's worth also mentioning that all of these texts are citing Foucault directly, and they are citing the history of sexuality directly. So, you know, these aren't just being pulled out of nowhere. These are explicitly building on Foucault's ideas. But what Deborah states is that is starting to, again, develop those ideas of Foucault, and this is where we're really getting into the queer theory now, which is exclusion sets the limits of inclusion. Now, that's quite an important idea, because if we recall Foucault's approach and Foucault's conceptions, the law is the thing which makes things illicit. So the law excludes, and the opposite, or the inversion of exclusion, is inclusion. So illicit and licit, exclusion and inclusion. And the process here, or the dialectical process used by neo-Marxist and post-structuralist academics, is to, as we know, you begin by developing a contradiction. So the contradiction that Foucault developed was that we thought we were all dealing with historicism and ideology, but in fact we were nested within this system of discourses. Now, having come to awareness of this contradiction, we can then start to reform each of those through praxis, and then in turn move towards a more integrated future. So whilst, for example, Butler states that the idea is to create confusion, there is nonetheless going to be a more integrative set of categories. There's going to be a more integrative understanding developed, which is at some level is going to reduce the number of contradictions. And one of the way of reducing the number of contradictions is to get rid of the sexual dimorphism and move into this arbitrary spectrum between people. But here we can quite clearly see that the exclusion is the opposite of inclusion, so things which have been excluded need to be included. This isn't a new theory, and of course it still pertains, or it still references obliquely and is in line with Foucault and Rubin's ideas when it comes to pederasty. So the hope is that the truth of the minority might persuade the normative folks to transform their racist, sexist and heterocentric attitudes. So what we can see here is that a very typical dialectical approach, which is that one form of oppression in society is dialectically reflected in each of the other forms of oppression in society. So not only is the existing historicist epoch an epoch in which racism, sexist and heterocentric attitudes can take place, but all of the magnitude of the problems associated with them take place in that historicist epoch. And their idea, or their way of looking at the world, is that if you can move out of that historicist epoch, you will then dispense with those problems, because you will have reformed all of the categories and understanding identity that people have. Indeed, the bourgeoisie and proletariat will have all killed each other, and they'll have moved into their happy new era somehow. Big kind of question mark around that, but that's deliberate. So likewise here, you emphasize how there's a connection between queer, the racist, the sexist, the heterocentric. It's all, the whole system is swilling in misery, and now that we've defined it as swilling around in misery, we have the answer. We're going to move into this new epoch, and of course now you need to you've got the principle of inclusion. So instead of getting rid of, if you're in critical race theory, instead of getting rid of racism, you include the idea of racism, and you say, well, maybe racism is a fact of reality, so you need to have the right people being racist, and those right people being racist in the right positions of power to have the right kind of social organization. When it comes to sexism, then you obviously need to include things on the sexuality front and the heterocentric front. So you need to integrate the homosexual. If those each come across as inconsistent, then you're right, because the way that many of these developments take place is whether they are of political utility, depending on a certain position. So don't expect, for example, the exact same process to apply in one area as it applies to the other. It depends on who's the oppressive group, who's the victim which can be co-opted by neo-Marxist and post-structuralist academics and be turned towards the revolutionary process. So that's really the thing which governs what type of aspect is included. It's not just going to be willy-nilly. It doesn't reproduce itself perfectly in each different area. So the emphasis here on Deborah, and it's more in the title. I haven't actually gone into the detail of it, but it's the use of new knowledge. So this is the kind of the lived experience aspect coming back through, which finds its roots in Sartre, but actually goes quite deep into Marxist philosophy. In in the same period where he was writing German ideology, he wrote his 11 theses on Feuerbach. Now, go onto my website and I've got an article on the theses on Feuerbach. It explains what they are and it goes through their meaning. But thesis number 3 in his series, Marx has a point where you need to teach the teachers in order to foment the revolution. You know, people don't just completely radically change the way that they view the world and then decide to throw off the world as it is. There needs to be a long process of educating people and then educating later generations. And so it's this dialectical process where a subtle number of changes in ideas at one point cascades all the way through time into much more developed iterations of that idea. So you've got this, you know, kind of minor, I don't say minor, but it's the quite clear separation of sexuality and sex in Foucault. Now we're starting to see it all unravel. So you've got one teaching the teachers. So you've got one excellent academician who teaches the other academics, then they go out and apply. And this is really what we're looking at here, is the dialectical evolution of these ideas. So we come back to Butler, and there are queer theory aspects in this work. So if we look at the first quote, she states that if there is a sexual domain that is excluded from the symbolic and can potentially expose the symbolic as hegemonic rather than totalizing in its reach, it must then be possible to locate this excluded domain either within or outside that economy and to strategize its intervention in terms of that placement. Now, if this makes your head hurt, then I can completely feel sympathetic with you. What she's getting at here is that is playing on this Derridian idea of the signifier and the signified. This likewise finds itself in neo-Marxist psychology. You know, you've got a psychology which is alienated, but it's kind of a reflection of the real psychology that people are supposed to possess. And of course, the real psychology people are supposed to possess are the ones that, or is the psychology that academics have told them that they have to possess, that the Marxists tell them what their psychology should be in the future society. So here, the symbolic is referring more towards the psychoanalytical aspects, but if you're referring to it as hegemonic rather than totalizing in its reach, the distinction that's being made there is that totalizing is an integrative union. This I explore in my book using fractals. The idea is that everything is interconnected through all different levels. So you can think of almost like a pyramid. Everything has an organizing totality to which it's pointed, and you've almost got this pyramid built out of lots of little pyramids, and so for example, a person is a totality, a society is a totality, a discourse would be one type of totality, your unconscious might be another form of totality, as would be your entire psyche. So these are all different levels of totality, and at the very end of history in the Marxist and neo-Marxist system is you've got the highest totality. Obviously in Hegel's philosophy, as we said, that is reconstituting God, so that's the absolute. When we come to Marxist philosophy, it's the unity of collective humanity with nature, so that's the ultimate totality. So what's being argued here is that if it's hegemonic rather than totalizing, well, it's kind of like a false. It's not the totality. It's a false turn. It's the erroneous product, which ought to have become totalizing, but became waylaid in its hegemonic, dominant, oppressive manifestation. So, of course, where you start to recognize that there's this horrible hegemonic aspect which is preventing the ideal dialectical process in people's action and people's consciousness, you need to recognize that, break apart the existing relations, and then integrate the things which were excluded. And that's essentially what's stated right here. So you locate the excluded domain, either within or outside that economy, and to strategize its intervention in terms of that placement. So because it has been excluded, its exclusion is a result of all of the existing power relations. What you need to do is to bring that back in. There's specific knowledge there, and there needs to be a steady process of strategically reintegrating all of those things that were excluded. Now, of course, taking that as a principle, do you just want to include everything that's been excluded? We obviously see how this complements the ideas of Foucault and Rubin earlier on. And indeed, Butler and Rubin had both... there's an interview between them where they are both discussing their enjoyment in reading Foucault's works and how, he provided a new revolutionary basis for moving forward, because Marxism wasn't quite sufficient as a revolutionary theory for feminism, obviously because of its primarily its religious and its economic focus. It wasn't so focused on sexuality. So anyway, the excluded term is an excluded sexuality that contests the self-grounding pretensions of the subject, as well as its claims to know the source and object of its desire. So here, it's quite clear to see that, as we have with the Derridian aspect, is that the excluded sexuality represents people who would actually have that sexuality. And obviously there's been a process of casting them out of society, and the idea is to begin to include the terminology, include the sexuality, include the people, and in the process you're going to disrupt the present understanding about people's understanding of sexuality and the way that people desire others and their pleasures and so on and so forth. And so she also says, what remains unthinkable and unsayable within the terms of an existing cultural form is the marginalized, not the excluded. So here there's a bit of a shift. So I've been using the language of exclusion, inclusion. Here there's a subtle change, and it is marginalized. So exclusion is being framed as more of a kind of a static, permanent process. It's ongoing, it's being constituted. Marginalized, however, alters the linguistic description. Marginalized suggests pushed out to the edges. So the subtle thing which happens here within the Marxist way of looking at the world is you've got social relations with the material world, and then different collectives have social relations with others. Some of those, all of those social relations in the Marxist framework are permeated by oppression. So, the government oppressed the people, the capitalist factory owner oppresses his workers, so on and so forth, ad nauseum. But what's happening here, and what happens through Foucault, is that it's through the discourses that power is exerted back on people. So you've got oppressive power relations which are reflected in the discourse. Power is imposed back on people through the discourses and in physical actions. And now here what you have is a shift. So you're looking to the marginalized. Now the subtle thing which this does is there's a leveling which takes place. Instead of looking at a hierarchy like a pyramid, you're looking at things like a disc, and the things which are excluded are outside the boundaries. And what you're attempting to then do is to take the things which are marginalized, so they're victims, they've been pushed outside the boundaries, but it's possible to reintegrate them. And that essentially is the process of what's going on here. So it's very easy to understand why she says that when something is unthinkable or unsayable, it's already recognized within the culture. It's not accepted by the culture. It's marginalized, but it is possible to become reintegrated. And that's the argument which is being begun to be developed here. Now, of course, when we think to what things might be unthinkable or unsayable within the current culture, and a lot of the ideas that have already been discussed by Foucault and Rubin, it's not going to take too much to hazard a guess about precisely what they are. children consenting and so on and so forth would be presumably permissible, because they are things that we would say are unthinkable and unsayable because it's so disgusting. Butler also has an inquiry into incest, and so the idea here is that if some forms of desire are displaced, that's likewise reflected in language. So you have terminology as well as verbal practices and practical behaviours which are excluded, and then this has effects on the collectives which can be manifested in society. Obviously, individual identity, what individual experiences can be heard and learned from, and influences the form of the family. So the incest taboo as the mechanism that tries to enforce discrete and internally coherent gender identities within a heterosexual frame. So what she's saying here is that the incest taboo is one of the mechanisms by which heterosexuality is sustained. Its existence appears to suggest that desires, actions, indeed pervasive social practices of incest are generated precisely in virtue of the eroticization of that taboo. So what that means is that the taboo itself is eroticized, and the eroticization of the incest taboo leads to a whole sequence of desires, actions, and pervasive social practices of the heterosexual frame. And so obviously if you break the incest taboo, then you change the way that consciousness and identities are socially constructed. So this is one of the means of introducing the gender confusion is the breaking of the incest taboo. Though one of the questions that you might ask is that if you break the monogamous kinship, then do you likewise break the prohibition? If you are seeking to root the identity elsewhere, then what occurs to the incest prohibition? These kind of ideas or these questions that you might be interested to understand the answer to, they're not really explored. But what we do have is a new notion, which is gender performativity. And this is that there are a whole sequence of practical behaviours, the way you're attracted to people, the way you speak, the way you dress and act. These are all part of the constitution of gender performativity. It's something which is done in public. It's in the view of the social eye. And so we see her stating very much in Foucauldian fashion that the very notions of an essential sex and a true or abiding masculinity or femininity are also constituted as part of the strategy that conceals gender's performative character. So right there we have a clear Foucauldian argument that you have a discourse, there's a discourse and it contains a strategy, and obviously the themes in this strategy are masculinity and femininity, and what they do is they are exclusive of gender. So this is something which we already saw in Gayle Rubin's document about gender and sexuality being split, was that gender was a type of theory. It's a strategic theory, and strategic themes such as masculinity and femininity are in opposition to the strategic theory of gender and then gender's performativity, so its collective and its public nature. So the next key idea that Butler develops is, what would it look like if a person was not constrained by the previous strategic categorizations of sex, which are used to, perpetuate the oppressive phallocentric norms of heteronormative society. And one of the ones that is explored would be, so quote, "I would suggest as well that drag fully subverts the distinction between inner and outer psychic space and effectively mocks both the expressive model of gender and the notion of a true gender identity." So there's two things here, and that is that by partaking in drag, you are subverting the sex discursive strategies which perpetuate the phallocentric norm, the male norm, the masculine norm, in which there's dimorphism between man and woman. So by partaking in drag, you are placing the imagery of the other on yourself, and you are subverting the fact that there is a distinction. You've actually got that on your body. You're partaking in it. You're experiencing it. Your people's desires in relation to you, the way that people act in relation to you, the way that people speak in relation to you. All of these new expressions now come up, and you've got all these new experiences. But fundamentally, this process of adopting the marginalized onto the other, but on your body itself, is something which inherently mocks the previous idea that there is a true gender. So drag is the process by which you are moving from one to the other. You know, you're rejecting any kind of intrinsic gender identities, particularly any that would be rooted on sex. So it gives us a clue to the way in which the relationship between primary identification, that is the original meaning accorded to gender, and subsequent gender experience might be reframed. So of course, in the process of subverting identity, you want to use the drag process, use the drag clothing, the drag behavior, and so on and so forth. And this is explicitly a means of taking the thing that was marginalized. So you're marginalized on a personal, individual level for you. So if you're a man, the thing which would be marginalized would be the feminine. And if you're a woman, the thing that would be marginalized would be the masculine. So what you do is you flip over, you invert, you occupy the other. And then in doing so, you occupy this new third space, which is neither of them. But in the process, you are mocking them. And the reason that mocking is actually quite important here, and it's a very subtle point, but it comes through from Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche's philosophy is integrated into neo-Marxist philosophy by figures such as Bataille and Sartre and Marcuse we saw, but his is via Freud. But the mockery is something which in Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, laughter is the thing which destroys. You destroy with comedy, you destroy with laughter. And so what's being said here through that Nietzschean thread, which is pulled through subtly, is that it destroys the old. So of course now with drag, you now have a breaking of the heterosexual norms. You've got new behaviours which were previously excluded from society, recognised only to be marginalised, now integrated, now practiced, now embodied, and this becomes the new norm. So really the whole collective consciousness of society has been reformed, and these become the new practices in which people partake. So power over identity is displayed on the body, it's spoken, it's practiced. And what we can see here is that there's been a complete deconstruction of identity as it previously existed, and then identity itself has been reattached to the things which have personal meaning for the individual. But the way it must have personal meaning is that it cannot be within the old framework. It needs to be in the new framework, and the reason it needs to be in the new framework is because the old one is intrinsically positioned as being victimizing and harmful and marginalizing to others. So it's permeated by erroneous power relations, whereas the new system is permeated by the good power relations. Now, in order to demonstrate how totalitarian this really is, in the same document, Gender Trouble, Butler rejects the idea of negotiation as it's presently understood. Now, I haven't put the full quote in here, but essentially what her argument is that the position of power that people occupy has an influence on the form of negotiation. Now, of course, if you go back to what we've covered throughout, particularly the last lecture and this present lecture, you've got the different historical sequences. You're moving from one epoch to another. Well, negotiation is one of those aspects. Negotiation itself would be a discourse, and it would have certain discursive and practical aspects associated with it, and people doing certain things, coming to a negotiation, coming to an agreement, and then proceeding. Well, here the idea is that that old form of negotiation where people essentially came to an agreement, they looked past their problems, well, that itself is contaminated by ideology. What is actually needed is a system of negotiation which refuses to concede to the old order. So you've got a fundamentally anti-democratic and anti-free speech position being evolved. It's not said so bluntly, but that is what it is. So next we have Mary Bryson and Suzanne de Castel. Again, they're exploring the ideas of queer pedagogy. So we've already kind of touched on this briefly, but this is how queer is going to be integrated into the space of education. So, quote, a radical form of educative praxis implemented deliberately to interfere with, to intervene in the production of normalcy in schooled subjects. So what we're seeing here is how queer is a type of pedagogy. So pedagogy being the indoctrination of certain ideas. So it's radicalism, and it's a form of educative praxis. So there's a new set of behaviors, and there are theories which are mental representations of those behaviors. And so this educative praxis will reform the way in which teaching takes place, who the teachers are, the way in which they teach, the way in which things are graded, and where someone's deemed as passing or being successful in something. Indeed, it will change the contents or the style of the way that the teaching takes place. You can really see that this obviously comes through from Gramsci and the subaltern classes. But particularly, you've got the ideas from Butler, which we've obviously just explored. So you've got this Nietzschean laughter, the destructive aspect of taking on the garb and the performances of the thing which is supposedly your opposite, but in fact it's a false opposition. And so here we're saying that the queer pedagogy is going to be a praxis. You're going to change the children's behavior, change the teachers' behaviors and their theories, change the educational system, change the children because of the practices that they are taught and then the theories that they use to represent the world around them. And so this new radical educative queer praxis is deliberately implemented to interfere with the production of normalcy. So again, here now we're seeing what Butler clearly said was the marginalized, but what was quite apparent in Foucault was the distinction between the illicit and the licit, moderated by law. And so here, yes, you can see that the queer pedagogy is explicitly designed to disrupt the ideas of normalcy in school subjects. So it's to disrupt the ideas of normality, of what is normal, what is right and wrong, what is moral in society as it exists in children. So by radical, we mean to imply that a primary aim of the course was to enter eyes and arms open into the perilous arena constituted by various projects of queer identity politics. So again, we see how the praxis, the revolutionary praxis, is designed to open people up to the new idea, to the new queer politics which is being implemented in schools. So the idea obviously is to make people amenable and open to it. So in order to do this, you can come back to thinking about Marx's early works. You stratify all good and all wrong between the two different groups, and here you would concentrate all good, things which are enjoyable and fun and accepting and positive. They're all wholly concentrated on one, whilst the other is reframed as the exclusive, the harsh, the cruel, the unenjoyable, the strict schooling system which emphasizes that you must get grades in order that your work can then be exploited, and so on and so forth. So queer identity politics is here being, it here informs the educative praxis, the way that children conduct themselves and the way that they see the world. So that's explicit. And obviously the theme that it's political, or that it serves as the basis of truth on which politics is developed, is continual throughout all of these different documents. You can find it yourself if you go and find either, if you either rent copies of the books or if you get PDFs, you can do a search and you'll see the politics is throughout these. So queer pedagogy could refer to the deliberate production of queer relations and to the production of subjectivities as deviant performance. So coming back to what we already understand, you have a whole host of material relations in the world, and then you've got all the discourses that are reflecting those material relations. They in turn are reflected in the institutions and the praxis that people conduct themselves with. So what you're, instead of looking at things like the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, or the bourgeoisie and the subaltern, what we're kind of now what we are now stratifying as is a society in which there is sex and sexual dimorphism versus a collective in which there is no sexual dimorphism. And this is the Foucauldian aspect. So it's rejecting sex and sexuality being contingent on sex, and in place putting in the fact that sex is contingent on sexuality, and sexuality is of course populated by the people who put the contents into the discourse, so it's the lived experience. So the lived experience of queer relations, so queer relations between individuals, between groups, things which are excluded from society, so the deviant performances, all of these subjectivities, all of these individuals are re-included within the queer pedagogic system. So, quote, a kind of postmodern carnivalesque pedagogy of the underworld as agitation, and then different parenthesis here, implemented deliberately to interfere with, to intervene in the production of so-called normalcy in school subjects. So that's just a re-quote of actually the first quote on this page, but the idea is that it's a carnivalesque pedagogy of the underworld. So not really the kind of terminology or standards of rigor that I'd be expecting if people were to be influencing the education of children. In fact, this is the complete opposite when we understand Foucault's ideas. This is the integration of the perverse into children's education. This is the integration of the perverse into the way that children conduct themselves, into how they see the world, what they consider as normal and acceptable, as moral, as legal, as what should be educated with others, and what should be experienced. So, yeah, it is what it is. So coming back to discourses, so queer theory we can really sum up as a discursive strategy. That is technically, under Foucault's system, what it is. And it seeks the inclusion of the marginalised. So you bring the perversions, the excluded, the ejector of society, and you take it and you bring it back in. In Foucault, that's obviously the pederasts, and obviously we understand his own interest in that. And then in Rubin, we have the same, it's boy lovers, it's not pederast, but, it's the exact same thing. And then in Butler, we have ideas of the unthinkable. So these are all connective threads in my view. You might be free to disagree, but I think that the premises are all there. I think that the same objects of critique and the same processional movements with regards to those things that have been ejected and critiqued are akin to one another. I think they're arguing the same thing. And so what we can see here is that gender is performatively constructed. It is different to sex. It displaces sex. In fact, it's inherently opposed to sex. It is the third category which exists somewhere new. It laughs at sex. It attempts to destroy it. It does that by openly mocking it in its actions, in its verbal utterances, in the ideas, or the theories rather, that the people hold. And queer is quite explicitly to be anti-normal and to be inclusionary. And that flows directly from all of the ideas here. The strange, the marginalised, the thing which is outside is the thing which needs to be reintegrated. So on the one hand, we have the destruction of sex and the occupation of something where lived experience populates your gender. and then queer, which is the anti-normal. And so obviously genderqueer is the person who performatively practices, who performs on their body, but likewise practices physically and verbally the integration of non-normality. So that's actually what the technical term of genderqueer really means when you start to break apart all the ideas within this academic literature. So the two parts which you typically see within the dialectical system is you have to have the negative and the positive. So the negative aspect is that it's intrinsically oppressed by sex. So sex is something which is violent, it's harmful, it's intolerant. This needs to be overcome. And so gender and queer then become negative with regards to heterosexuality. They negate the heterosexuality. And then the positive is the fact that it's inherently political. So you posit a new society, new social relations, new ways of conducting yourself in private, in public, with other people, with people you're attracted to. You develop new terms and names which describe all of the different behaviours that people have always taken part in throughout all of human history, and you reform all of society under this new discourse. And all of this comes through academia. You know, the main academicians teach the next level of intellectuals. They include it in their courses, and then it goes wider and wider into the culture. And so over a series of years, you move fairly steadily from, you know, the natural way of looking at the world, of relationships, and instead moving on to new arbitrarily populated social engineering schemes created by intellectuals in the academy, here underpinned by Marxist philosophy. So continuing on, we're going to look more at the discourses and the subversion. So we're going to keep building on a lot of the ideas of Rubin and Foucault and Butler, who we've just explored, as well as Bryson and Stone. So we'll be going through a few more, and this is looking at a lot of the discursive aspects. So Spargo further explores Foucault's ideas. There's not going to be any surprises at this point anymore, and there's a lot of the rest of this which is going to be just gathering more evidence and more examples, but for the requirement to demonstrate that it's not just a one-off, it's not just cherry picking. I want to accumulate a fair bit of evidence and convince you that the ideas are common, that they are endemic throughout their literature. It's not just in one place, or it's not just from one person. So Tamsin recognises that queer is in tension with gay and lesbian discourses. So what we're seeing here is that not only is heterosexuality an apparent discourse, but so is homosexuality. So when we're looking at the historicist movement from one epoch to another, there's a whole network of relationships which are related to one another. If you recall the wagon wheel and all the different spokes and the different fellows, all the different fellows were the different ideas, and they were all related and reflecting one another. Well, here, the discourse of biology, of sex, of heterosexuality, of homosexuality, these are all taking part in a reflective cycle of one another. And when you're trying to break apart many of those relations, you need to breaking apart of one set or one group of ideas, or of biology as being the basis for sex and sexuality, then you're going to have to get rid of all of the other ones. And when you're situating this as a discourse, then naturally queer discourse becomes in contradiction with heterosexual and homosexual discourses, if you believe they're discourses. So what's being done here is that heterosexuality is being supplemented in a way by homosexuality. So you're putting one into the other and using it to destroy both and reform. And that reflects the real principle of supplementation in Derrida's philosophy, which is you position something as being part of a false origin. So the old origin, the old understanding was something that you had to progress through, but it was nonetheless at the end of the journey revealed to be hollow. It was actually a void. But by going through that journey, you reveal that because there is that void, you need to fill it with something else. You need to fill it with a thing with meaning. You need to fill it with a thing which is more materialist. And so, yeah, you get rid of heterosexuality and homosexuality. Turns out that they were supplementary concepts, and instead there's now queer instead. So the behavior itself critiques culture and reforms people's sexuality. So queer is here something embodied, and it's the action itself which is in the process of critique. And it's quite important to recognize in Marxist philosophy that critique is part of praxis. So praxis is the action, and then the theory, which is the representation of the action. So critique is, if I was right now critiquing something, then that would be an action. And then in the process of critiquing, which tears down that thing or which destroys it, which finds out the victimhood, and all these kind of different Marxist approaches to critique, in the process of doing this, I'll have learned other things. I'll have found other objects to grasp at and to critique. I'll have found other things which need to be critiqued in a different way in order to get people to respond correctly to what I want them to do. So, yeah, the critique is part of praxis, and then the critique, whilst being enacted, helps to reform itself, and then it can be pushed in. So obviously where queer itself is a behaviour that critiques culture, queer is a dialectical process in which people conduct themselves differently, speak differently, have a different kind of consciousness, and that this is continually invested in changing the norms of society. So it's this continual process. Likewise, we see that queer subverts heterosexuality and homosexuality. Not a surprise, given that its intention with those discourses. You want to get rid of the discourses, and then by getting rid of the discourses, you change the way people behave, you change the way people speak, the ideas that they have, and then eventually you get rid of those people. So essentially, at the end of the queer rainbow, there is no homosexuality or heterosexuality. There's just no linguistic description of them. In that sense, they no longer exist in that sense. People use different language to describe them. So transgender usually refers to those who refuse or disrupt the cultural norms of masculine and feminine appearance or behaviour, and their assumed correspondence to pre-existing biological maleness or femaleness. Well, nothing new there. So Berlant and Warner in 2003, so they describe... They've got a paper, and it describes that what we want to promote as the radical aspirations of queer culture building. So here you can see the more Gramscian vein of deposing the masculine hegemony of believing that there are two sexes. That's a kind of ideology. It's a false discourse, and so queer culture is a kind of subaltern class which needs to develop its own theories, its own discursive practices, its own relations, its own kind of family, its own social institutions, and which needs to then develop its own culture. And this needs to be represented at all levels of society. It needs to you need to have queer forms of knowledge in all of the different academic areas by dialectically reforming them. So you'll go into a science, for example, like chemistry, and you'll say, okay, well, what's the effect on the reaction of the chemist being queer? It is stuff like this, and then perhaps more likely, because it's not really to do with the chemistry, it's more to do with the sexuality aspect. It's just dispensing with the chemistry and the science, and it would actually just be talking about chemical sexuality or something like that. I don't know. So, yeah, queer culture is here part of a world-making project. So this is very much in the Marxist sense. You've got your different historicist epochs. You've got your more integrated endpoint, and you're marching towards that endpoint. The endpoint in this framework is queer, and so you're constructing the queer world. So there's an explicit political project, and every aspect of culture and every place where culture is manifested needs to be directed towards that. And so you'll see some statement like, queer and other insurgents have long striven, often dangerously or scandalously, to cultivate what good folks used to call criminal intimacies. Okay, so there's nothing there that needs to be explained beyond what we've already said for Foucault. So criminal intimacies. So these are things like pederasty, incest, bestiality, necrophilia. These would be all of the criminal intimacies that are, of course, illicit. Now, if you obviously believe that they're just discourses, then you can take these marginalised things and reintegrate them back into society. And of course, where you've got queer pedagogy, then this can be taught explicitly to the children to reform the way that they conduct themselves and view the world. So, contexts of queer world making depend on parasitic and fugitive elaboration through gossip. This is actually a recapitulation of one of Marx's very early ideas in the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844, in which he stated that when communist workmen associate with one another, theory, propaganda, etc. is their first end. Well, here we can quite clearly see that contexts of queer world making depend on parasitic and fugitive elaboration through gossip. So gossip here essentially is a stand-in for the propaganda, and the parasitic is the dialectical process, because they are inherently not particularly creative. What you do is you look at the existing landscape of knowledge, ideas, practices, cultural developments, and you take each of them and then you redo them through the new lens. So it's not particularly creative, but it's very good at copy and paste with certain edits, and those edits, of course, need to be rooted in the new form of truth, and in the truth itself. This new dialectical truth informs the politics and the society which should be built thereon. And of course, if it needs to be gossiped, if gossip is part of the praxis, then you're always talking about it. It needs to be everywhere at all times, represented in all social relations. People need to express themselves verbally and explicitly positive for this new culture, this world-making project. And they must also be given the framework to negate the prior. So Chevrette also has another paper. And so there's the idea that, of course, with the victim aspects, so the discursive violence of heteronormative discourses. So the violence is that certain behaviours are being conducted, certain verbal practices are being conducted. They are represented in the discourses. So the heteronormative discourse where people are heterosexual, likewise where that's a norm, but likewise where you have things which are excluded from society, this discourse itself is violence. It's something which is destructive, it's harmful, it induces suffering. And this is either by the people who supposedly benefit and are put into a position of social power by this discourse, or it induces the people who are marginalised to harm themselves. And so any utterance of the old discourse through one means or another sustains violence, causes oppression, reinstitutes the old hierarchical power structures, and perpetuates the entire system of oppression, here between sexual dimorphics and then people who are of the third category. So Chevrette argues that there's a need to integrate queer theory into academic research, and that it must be distinct from the straight gay paradigm. So again, we're just seeing the reiteration of what's already been said. Quote, strategies to accomplish these goals include the use of inclusive language, the dismantling of the similarity/difference framework. We can better avoid reproducing the forms of epistemic and material violence. So again, strategies, so this is coming into the discursive aspects, and the new discourse needs to essentially be rooted around the use of inclusive language. So the language you're always going to use is this person is a victim, this person is harmed, this person is subject to offences, they are offended, this person is a victim of violence, harm, exclusion, bias, whatever it is, you name it. Everything that's negative is associated with them, and everything positive is associated now with the new and inclusive language. So in order to be a good person, in order to be moral, in order to be an upright member of society and doing one's civic duty, one must be inclusive. And so the language which is developed must reflect this desired praxis, And once the new language has been developed and is taught to people, then they change the way they behave. And then they supposedly have new theoretic representations of the material world, which likewise through the dialectical process are continuously reformed. So you're continually spiraling through these different historical epochs towards this new preferred end. And of course, this is rejecting any boundaries, the similarity / difference framework. So you're not categorizing people into groups where they're supposedly similar or different. You're getting rid of that. And what that will help, or what that will also influence, is the other discourses where there is epistemology. So this is knowledge. So we're talking about philosophy and the sciences, how we come to knowledge, and then the methodologies which we apply to develop data which we can understand and analyze, use to confirm or disconfirm hypotheses, and to then come to understanding. So by using the inclusive language, you can undo old forms of knowledge which are tied to the material violence which sexual dimorphism and heterosexuality exert on the non-heterosexual. Dembroff has, again, some very similar ideas called the critical queer kind. So a kind is kind of like a collective. This is drawing more on Georges Canguilhem and then Donna Haraway's work. Donna Haraway's explicitly, but the ideas will begin more in Canguilhem. And it's the kind. So it's a collective which is a bit beyond the human. So kind in Donna Haraway can be collectives which include pagan deities such as Gaia, and potentially even animals. So a kind whose members enact resistance against dominant gender ideology, whose members collectively resist the binary assumption. So here the concept of the critical queer kind themselves is that their entire being is ontologically opposed to the existing binary assumption. So that is what their identity is. And you can quite clearly see that once you create an identity whose very essence is that they are opposed to the binary assumption, is that those two categories now exist in conflict with one another. So that's where the victimhood comes in. You create the content, the category, which is inherently a victim. People move into the category and then they scream about how they're oppressed and how they're miserable and a victim of the old. But in reality, it's something which is engaged with and is fueled by themselves. And that's because there's the moral currency that goes with victimhood. And if you're a victim, then ultimately you can claim restitution from society, from the people who have victimized you. And ultimately, if that fails, there's also the cause of self-defense, which is then the explicit use of violence. And that's obviously how the proletarians progressed in Soviet Russia, is really that they were defending themselves against the capitalists. So non-critical queer kinds are those who perpetuate the dominant gender ideology in that society. So we see how obviously the two are opposed to one another. So genderqueer cannot exist in contexts where persons are so bereft of access to gender-deviant presentations, concepts, and language that they are unable to perform speech acts and behaviours that would collectively resist the binary assumption. So here we can also see that earlier when I put my summary of what the term genderqueer means, we can see it represented here again in the academic literature. So consistent in that respect. And understanding the core premises coming through from Foucault, who others, simply make some, they apply it some widely, but providing you have the core premises in Foucault, you can understand exactly what genderqueer really means. And here it's quite clear that it's the non-sexual aspect, it's the sexuality, but it's the deviant aspect which is important. And so we can see here, that the identity, the way people conduct themselves, is to have access to the deviance, whether it's the presentation publicly through action, through the adoption of certain wear through certain statements, through certain behaviours, ways of expressing yourself, concepts, language, so on and so forth. Genderqueer must have access to that, and it must be deviant. So we understand exactly how that identity is constituted. We understand, based on Foucault's ideas and Foucault's proclivities, what that identity means. So lastly, and I thought it was useful to probably put one of the images back in here, because we haven't had one for a while, just to refresh memories. So queerness as an organising logic includes and goes beyond sexual orientation and gender identity to interrupt normative power relationships and institutions. So again, we're just seeing the exact same thing, which is that queer is fundamentally opposed to normalcy, it's opposed to sexual dimorphism, the male-female divide, sex, existing psychiatry, biology, law, the praxes that are manifest in society, and then how these are represented in institutions. So, for example, if we have an institution will have policies which govern conduct in the workplace. The idea here would be to now explicitly represent queer in the policies of the workplace. And so you would expect to see things where, because the identity is by nature of the way it's been constructed, is intrinsically oppressed by existing sexual dimorphic categories, so male and female, and then sex and biology. Because it's intrinsically oppressed by them, it needs protection against those things. And then so you start to see basically the anti-realism, which rejects the real world, which rejects reality. You start to see this then represented in institutions, through people's embodiment, through their practices, through their verbal practices. So it comes into the institutions primarily through people who've gone through the academic training in these various areas, broadly under the umbrella of social justice. So social justice is one of the things which unites. Earlier where we saw that queer was related to the racist aspects, or the heteronormative aspects, or the economic aspects. All of these different components, all of these different outcrops of neo-Marxist ideas and methodology, they're all related to one another, and social justice is one of the processes of using the collective's social consciousness to recognise its unique iteration of justice and politics, in effect, towards the ultimate goal of their particular strategy. So if it's, depending on which area it is, if it's critical race theory, it's the establishment of a racist society. If it's Marxism, it's the establishment of humanity in relation to nature as the new form of divinity. So sexuality after Foucault, number 3. So we're getting on to queer criminology now. And this is not a surprising development, but what we'll see is how Foucault's ideas are then adopted by people who are studying criminology and the implications of Foucault's ideas for criminology. So got Walker and Panaville 2017. So they quote someone else, Halperin, who's saying that queer is by definition whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. There is nothing in particular to which it necessarily refers. So basically it's an antagonistic identity. Nothing new versus what we've seen. Walker and Panaville, they're quoting Butler on the political nature of the project. So they're looking at reading politics now into criminology, and the means of reading that politics in is through the queer discursive aspect, and we understand that because it's the lived experience as the basis of truth, which alters the contents of the discourse, the way people behave and speak. So there's again quoting, but because Foucault is quoted, we're not surprised when we see an argument against the idea that minors are incapable of consenting to sex. Now they are seen as being capable of consent. That comes straight from Foucault. It's figured in Foucault's ideas, And one of the things that they develop is the discourse around minor attracted persons. So what we're seeing here is a linguistic transformation. So when we earlier saw that the discourses need to make an alteration, shift to an inclusive language, you need to start to find linguistic terms which are preferential. You're starting to try and undo the marginalization. You're beginning the process of inclusion. So you want to diffuse the negative emotions which are associated with certain topics. You're trying to find the contradictions by which you can remove the emotional rejections or the scientific or philosophical rejections of certain things, and then to try and make it more acceptable. So you're trying to reduce the rejection in order that you can then strategically undo the marginalization and reintegrate. And so here there's the discursive aspect around the minor attracted persons, which is just a euphemistic labeling of paedophiles. So they're pederasts, and there's the people who are being sought out here to be helped through Foucauldian discourses. So Walker, Butters and Nichols further develop this. They look at the social reaction that people have to others who are paedophiles, and most people's reaction was that they would report them irrespective of crime being committed. That stood out to me as quite interesting because it suggests that there's something so intrinsically loathed about it, that there's something so disgusting about it, is that even without a crime, people would be proactive in reporting it. So I'm curious, although I don't know, but I'm curious whether there's actually something kind of biological going on there, which is the recognition that what a pederast can do is destroy an entire child's life if they don't end up killing them after the act, and that there's actually some sort of built-in mechanism against them. For example, even in prisons, pederasts are often kept in their own areas because even among the criminals of society, even among the murderers, there is a recognition that it's something so abhorrent that it's intolerable. So even though people would take ethics courses, they would not change their view that they would report them anyway. So that's why I thought that was quite interesting. But nonetheless, their approach now with this is to say, how can we tease apart and to try and change people's mentality on this? And so they challenge, do you actually need to report them? And the position taken is that if the person, even if the person has had a previous offence, this does not mean that this does not guarantee that there will be a future offence. I mean, you can argue that for anything, but I think that probably the consequences of the offence actually taking place warrant the report rather than the inverse. But nonetheless, they come to the conclusion that there's a need to reform the education of clinicians, presumably to take the view that a previous offence doesn't guarantee a future offence. Last we have Yanka, Blagden and Hill, and so they were asking pederasts what their preferences were on what they like to be called, and they chose minor attracted persons. So again, we can kind of see how what you're using here is the lived experience of the people who are marginalised, and you are taking the words, the terms or ideas and knowledge and practices associated with those people and trying to reintegrate it into society, finding the way that you can weasel out of the negative aspects, and then to try and find the positive way of euphemistically relabeling or reframing a certain group of people in order that they can then be made acceptable. Part 4 is now going to zoom in more precisely on queer pedagogy. I mean, it's been skirted around a number of times throughout this and indeed the last lecture. And indeed the next part will actually be about a specific part and manifestation of queer pedagogy as well. But if you think that this is going to necessarily let up in the content or the tone, then no, that's not the case. It's going to be much more of what we've just been covering. So don't be surprised when there's much more of the themes of pederasty and sexualization of children. So Dyer, 2017, She argues that sexual identity is socially constructed. So again, this is the idea that the material relations at the time are represented in consciousness, likewise represented in institutions and the contents of things that are taught, and are passed down successively through the generations. Obviously, in Foucault, this is incorporated under the discourses. But here, Dyer rejects the idea that there is innocence, so she frames it as a rhetoric, as a form of discourse. But particularly, it's one that's damaging to the development. So here, the idea of child innocence is damaging to the child's development. Of course, that requires and demands then, in order to avoid harming them, in order to avoid damaging them, an idea of child maturation. So the idea here is that they must queer the child so that the child is not embedded into a system of typical development like we would expect, and which prevents them from the opportunity to explore desire. So quite clearly, we're seeing that the child is restricted by innocence and the discourse on innocence, and really what needs to happen is that they must be allowed to explore their desires. So queer childhood can rupture conventional schemas of growing up, the enforcement of strict borders between childhood and adulthood, and forms affinities convened on grounds of mutual feelings of shame and difference. Here, it's very easy to again see the idea which has been throughout a number of the previous slides, that queer is something which is categorically opposed to sexual dimorphism. Here we're seeing how that manifests itself within the educational framework and the educational system. So a child, a heteronormative child, is a child which has been harmed. A queer child, however, is the child which is growing, which is complete, and their process of growing up is different. They're a dialectical child. They're a proletarian child, really, and that comes back from Vygotsky and some of the other early Marxist theoreticians. You can find some references to that in my book. So what we can see here is that Rubin's idea of delineating adult sexuality from the child and the child's sexuality, that's a border, that's the thing which the law controls, which it prevents the pederasty. And here we're saying the enforcement of strict borders between childhood and adult, whether it's just as an academic categorization or whether it's an actual concrete legal manifestation, this is something which is needing to be undone. And what's being argued here is that the reason that those borders exist are because there are mutual feelings of shame and difference. So this is arguably a projection of the person's feelings onto the people who are establishing laws which prevent certain interactions between an abuse of children by adults. And what's being argued is that the people who prevent adult sexuality and child sexuality interacting with one another are doing so because they themselves have certain feelings and are ashamed of them. So this is a classic case of likely projecting the motive onto the other people. No, parents do not want to keep other adults away from their children and prevent them from practicing sexuality because of their own shame and difference and feelings. It's because they want to protect their children, like any normal adult, and like every adult who has already existed and had children. So the queer child is a subject that hovers above and outside the histories of childhood. So this, again, is the historicist idea. You're saying that, or you're using the new discourses to negate the old. So you negate the idea of linear development, childhood development, which is, and then, that heterosexuality is a norm. You negate all of that, and then you posit that there's a future type of child. So the consciousness of academics is raised, and they become cognizant of the fact that there is this queer child. And so the idea now, having had the idea of the queer child, is to bring them forth. So very much like in Stone's document, where we were talking about how the transsexual was this new category which was between and opposed to sexual dimorphism between man and woman. that having recognized this category, you now need to pull people out of the old categories into the new one. Well, here's just the same. You need to pull children out of their heteronormative categories, whether they're heterosexual, whether they're homosexual, whether they see themselves as a boy or as a girl, and then you move them into the queer alternatives. So Dyer continued, their work, so this is referring to other academics, their work, like my own, is not interested in minimizing the corporeal or emotional impacts of sexual trauma experienced in childhood, but in understanding the possibility for children and youth to recruit amounts of bodily pleasure. So they're not apparently exploring this as part of a means of helping children. It's as a means of helping them to experience pleasure. Grotesque. And so queer theories of childhood are often brave in the way that they wade into such taboo territory in order to show how what is considered perverse is often a mode of securing heteronormativity, ... prove that children are capable of possessing complexity and sexuality. None of these are surprising nor new when we consider Foucault's ideas or what we've previously read. What you do is you get the children to do the wading into the taboo territory. So you get the children to become the ones who practice those things which were previously illicit, which were previously deemed perversions. You have the children then representing their consciousness, theories about those actions, and first and foremost you get them to verbalize them. So really what's being aimed towards is that it will be the children themselves that argue and agitate for their sexuality. If you presumably here, if you educate them sufficiently into that, into repeating the verbal ideas, they might be able to babble them, but not necessarily understand actually the consequences. But that's really not an issue here for these academics. They're very much interested in the child's sexuality, breaking down the barriers between adult and child sexuality, and particularly undoing the ideas that something should be excluded, that something is perverse, that something should be removed and kept out of society. It's the opposite of that process. And here it's the children who are being put as the group themselves who will negate the old system. So it's the child proletarian who undoes the previous legal system, the previous discourses. And obviously the child proletarian, when they become older, at least in this framework, ideally then become teachers who teach the same to the new children, and they have their dialectical reform of sexuality, which goes the whole way. Of course, when the process of inclusion is what you deem to be ethical conduct, then it's the steady inclusion of everything that has ever been deemed perverse, which of course, as we know, is pederasty, incest, bestiality, necrophilia, and whatever else there might be out there. So Dyer says that she hoped to queer the damaging rhetoric of childhood innocence by suggesting that we as adults clear a path for children to symbolize negativity, queer affect, and sexual curiosity. So what's being said here is that childhood innocence, like we said, is something oppressive, it's inherently harmful, it's damaging to the child, it's damaging to their to their development. And the antidote to this is that the adults basically do away with the old discourse of childhood innocence. And this is a feature of Derrida's deconstruction. When you deconstruct one concept, it has an impact on other concepts in that area. Likewise in Foucault, when you alter the contents and the strategies of one discourse, then it alters the discursive relations with other discourses. So here, there's, with the idea of queer, what we're just recognizing is that queer will be, and sexuality are one discourse, biology is a discourse. Biology is obviously attached to pre-puberty, puberty, and post-puberty. Of course, that's also typically understood as taking part through the advance of age. But when you break apart these these things, when you say that they're just discourses, that they're arbitrary, all they reflect is power relations, then the contents themselves are just reflections of power relations. The concept of age, the concept of puberty at different stages, these are actually just discursive practices that have turned into certain discursive contents, which act back on people, get them to inform their identity, get them to recapitulate the same behaviors, the same verbal utterances, but it's actually nothing, it's just power. Of course, if you're coming to sexual class consciousness, then you need to undo these. So Dyer's next paper in 2019, so queer pedagogy directs children towards the queer future. And yeah, I mean, it is what it says on the tin. So it's that project building, it's the building of a new culture, it's the rejection of society as it is in the present day for a queer iteration of society. And so, likewise, tapping back into the intrinsic victimhood, which is always used by those of the Marxist and post-structuralist tradition, the new discourse is, or questioning the queering of childhood innocence, or questioning the queering of child pedagogy, is, quote, thinly disguised homophobia and transphobia. There seems to be a bit of confusion here as to why homophobia is in that. Perhaps Dyer didn't really understand what she was doing, but transphobia would be more appropriate when we're talking about the alternative categories. I think this is probably because they're trying to be more inclusive with the terms, but it doesn't strictly conform to the reformation of the discourses, so there might be an understanding issue there. Anyway, so Dyer essentially looks at, as we've said, that it's the parents who have been deprived of certain ties and relationships, and that they then impose that deprivation back onto their children. So the idea here is to actually somehow free some higher form of relationship with the children, which was denied to their parents, and prevent the parents denying that same high relationship to their children and other adults around them. So the queer dimension of childhood is its potentiality to disturb normalcy and undo anticipated congruency and teleology between infancy and adulthood. Again, we see how queer is ontologically opposed to normalcy. So it must undo normalcy. That is its purpose. And it is explicitly against the current understanding of a linear development from infancy to adulthood. So different people progress at different rates. Fundamentally, when it comes to the proletarian child within the Soviet literature, there's a dialectical view of consciousness, and so the things which you place into the view of consciousness, the way in which you stimulate consciousness, induces the growth and development of that consciousness. And so here, obviously, what we're seeing is that the approach is that once you stimulate with certain ideas, certain practices, certain verbal utterances, certain ways of dressing, interacting with your peers, interacting with other people in society, breaking down the barriers between teachers and the students they teach, and on certain topics, whatever it happens to be, that all of these are different ways of reforming the child's consciousnness and getting to them to alter the way that they develop, and certainly by making them develop faster than they would under the so-called discourse of heteronormativity. So what you're really going to see here is the deliberate pushing of sexuality into education in order to induce that development. And so this will preempt any kind of discussion with the parents, and essentially the child will be aware of sexuality at a young age. And once once they're aware of that, there's no turning the clock backward. It's a permanent mark. It's a permanent ink, an indelible ink, which is left in the child's mind, which is directing them towards these neo-Marxist ideas. So this new form of childhood development would now be in a dialectical reform of their consciousness, in a dialectical reform of child, and the form of childhood would have one in which they could be feeling curious about sexuality. And so you can see here clearly that the collapse of the distinction between the adult and the child in the school environment allows the teacher to impregnate the child with these ideas on sexuality and queer pedagogy, and to alter the child's consciousness permanently. And so children are apparently ready, they have a youth's sexual agency. So I don't see if there's anything that could be more clearly stated about a child having the ability to consent and having agency over its sex and sexuality. That is what that statement says. That obviously comes straight from Foucault. We're not surprised why. And so the thing that Hannah is here decrying is that the child has that agency. They have the capability in their consciousness. It's really just the discourses and the social situation which have deprived the child of their intrinsic nature and prevented them from having access to that sexual knowledge. But had they had access to that sexual knowledge, then all of these people who would prevent this distinction between adult and child sexuality would actually cease to prevent that. They wouldn't seek to be, in her view, recreating these norms of flawed relationships, and that's the way it works in this inverted world of thinking. So queerness signals disturbance and resistance to normalcy, nothing new there, and I have used it to register that which resists domestication. So domestication here is a term with quite a lot of background behind it. This is really dipping into the work of Paulo Freire, who was a neo-marxist educational theoretician, famous for writing Pedagogy of the Oppressed and a number of other works. And what he was essentially doing was he was crashing neo-Marxist philosophy into Christianity to produce religious neo-Marxism. Now, how distinct that is from Marx's original system is debatable, given that at the end of Marx's system, his replacement for the Hegelian absolute is the union of humanity, collective humanity with nature. So that is his God at the end of Marx's system. It's the embodied then. And this is quite easy to understand when you recognise that Hegel had argued that science had torn down God, and so his philosophical project was to reorder all of existence and history's development and the development of intellectual thought towards the reconstitution of the divine, so the absolute. And then Feuerbach he basically says that, okay, well, if we're going through a philosophical project which reconstitutes divinity, then divinity is obviously contingent on humanity. God is issued from humanity. So we have this idea of God as an idea being projected out of human consciousness, and then that can be reintegrated. And that is what Feuerbach argues. Feuerbach argues that collective humanity is the new God. And then in Marx, it's essentially the same, but he rejects the philosophical side. He just wants collective humanity in relation to the material world as the new form of God. So when you later have Freire crash neo-Marxism into Christianity, it's not actually that much of a surprise if you really understand the bedrock of Marx's system and a lot of the philosophy which preceded it. Now, when it comes to Freire's system, what you're explicitly trying to do is collapse distinctions again, and he argues that the reason that past Marxist revolutions failed was because there was a contradiction between the revolutionary intellectuals and the revolutionaries themselves. So he's going back to this Gramscian idea where the subaltern need to have their own intellectuals, but everyone must be an intellectual. Everyone must be versed in the Marxist framework. And so Paulo Freire does the same. He does so initially as a bunch of Marxist intellectuals going into certain village environments and talking to the locals, understanding all of their social practices and their way of understanding the world, and then to slowly and steadily introduce them to certain ways of looking at the world. So that would be dialectical materialism and historicism. And with these two ideas together, you've got the bedrock of all of the Marxist framework. You've got the historical movement through sequences, and you also have the dialectical idea of that's how you govern your reasoning as a metacognitive system. So once you install those two ideas, you change the way that people interact with the world, the way they see themselves, and the beauty of having the dialectical system is that you can train people into regulating their own cognition so that it will always be oriented towards the certain goal. And the certain goal at the end of Freire's system is the recreation of utopia. So he's one of the old utopians. He's quite explicit. He knows exactly what he wants to establish, and he describes this as the completion of God's work. All of this is available in part 4 of my book, by the way. And Freire's got a couple of developments. So he performs a dialectical transformation of consciousness raising. He calls it conscientização. I'm butchering the language, it's Portuguese, but conscientização. And so this is a form of consciousness raising, but it's aware of the boundaries of existing knowledge, of existing cultural practices. It's a step above from the original Marxist ideas and notions of class consciousness, but particularly it's aware of the fact that the contradiction between revolutionary intellectuals and the rest of the revolutionary body is a barrier to the revolution. So it's this very specific type of consciousness raising where you need to recognize there's non-distinction. So in Freire's framework, both the teacher and the student are actually one and the same. They're a linked entity. And so the teacher at one point is the student, and the student at the other point is the teacher. So you can think of this as it's actually a two-way classroom at this point, but underpinned by revolutionary philosophy and revolutionary practices. Now, one part of Paulo Freire's intellectual framework for the way he describes things is domestication. And domestication in his framework is a recapitulation of Marx's idea of alienation. So you've got the false idea of the world, you've got the false understanding, you've got the false means of apprehending knowledge, you've got the false contents of knowledge themselves. You're seeing people as individuals rather than acting in solidarity with the collective. And you're not realizing that you're meant to be collectively creating knowledge, that all of you are working towards the revolution, and the revolution in Freire's framework is the completion of God's work. It's the utopian aspect, it's the neo-Marxist religious aspect, and so the domestication is a form of alienation which prevents you from understanding that entire process and then going through it. So that was a bit of a digression from what we were saying with the queerness and Hannah Dyer's work, but it's just to zone in on how sometimes individual terms, which are throughout many of the things I've quoted, have a deep body of neo-Marxist theory underpinning them. And so domestication in Freire's framework is actually the rendering of someone down into an animal. They are actually subhuman, and that's likewise a recapitulation of ideas in Marxism. So when we're saying here that somebody is alienated or domesticated, then what we're seeing is that queerness itself is the process that resists domestication. So now what you can do is look at the idea of alienation, and you can look at the idea of queerness, and you can see how the two of them are associated with one another. So heterosexuality, for example, would be one of those forms of domestication, one of the means of turning people into animals. If you also look at the exclusion of certain practices and certain verbal practices, that would also be a form of domestication, whereas queerness is the thing which is juxtaposed towards both of those, or queerness here, in other words, is the means of appropriating, reappropriating those things which were cast out. So it's the thing which reintegrates the perversions, and it's the thing which posits the new sexuality, which is divorced from sexual dimorphism. So fairly large digression there, but required to unpack the idea of domestication. And so, of course, innocence is one of the parts of the discourses which is used in constituting domestication. So you explicitly need to undo childhood innocence in order to prevent the animalization of children. That's how the thinking in this framework works. It's upside down. In order to prevent the children being turned into animals, you need to sexualize them. You need to realize their sexual agency. you need to allow them to undertake quests and adventures into sexual pleasure and experience. And the way that this is developed is through sex education. Neary and Rasmussen, so they likewise make very similar arguments. So heteronormativity, this is this discourse, it induces the children to develop along the heterosexual pathway. So queer theory has long attended to how discourses of innocence constrain and restrict childhood. Okay, so this is a fairly straightforward point now. We're not actually learning anything new, but important for recognizing that these ideas are broad throughout the literature. So here they argue for a queering of childhood innocence itself. This is, of course, a completely logical conclusion based on what we've just said. You know, childhood innocence is preventing them from preventing the transformation of the child into a truly proletarian child. It's the prevention of them realizing their sexuality and then being able to take part in sexual relations with the adults around them. But that's not necessarily too much of a distinction. Too much of a distinction because because Freire collapses the differences between teacher and student. They are interchangeable. They are one and the same. They are the two dyadic faces of a monadic one. So when they then say that deterritorializing the psychological singular subject of the child and removing childhood from the constraints of a particular age bracket, so the idea here is that, and this is more from Bataille's side of dialectical philosophy. Bataille had an idea in which what he wanted to achieve was that the person must embody the collective. So all human potentialities needed to be embodied within the individual in your consciousness. And so the idea he was trying to get at was that, you know, where you have a philosophy based on collectivism, what you need to do is try and displace your own individuality with a collective psychology. And so deterritorializing the psychological singular subject here, to me, sounds substantially more like Bataille's philosophy. You're trying to remove the idea that you are an individual who is, rather than being an individual expression of the collective, which is the preference generally within dialectical philosophy. So deterritorializing is you remove the previous power exerted in a certain area in which reaffirms that there is a psychological singular subject, and instead you remove the power of that previous conception and you replace it with the collectivized conception. So it's the psychological embodiment of the collective subject. And you can see how that ties into within the dialectical philosophies and their frameworks, how if you have the abstract, abstract's a bad word, if you had the third person subject who is looking back through history, who is the collective subject, that's the thing that you're trying to embody. So, you know, so when you're moving forward from the proletarian stage into the later stages, what you're trying to do is trying to destroy the old society and the old psychology, the old ideas, the old institutions, the old behaviors, so on and so forth. But in the process, you're aware that there is this future third person subject and you're trying to always embody them within yourself as an individual, but you're also trying to manifest them in the collective in society. So the proletariat, they've got a foot in the old world and a foot and sight of the new world. So foot in the old world, sight of the new world. So they need to destroy the old world and themselves, and then ideally within the Marxist framework you flop into the new age, in which case you've got greater clarity of vision of this collective third person subject which you're supposed to embody. So yeah, you get the children to do this. So Park then starts to argue that you can use art and expression, and so in Derrida's philosophy he argued that there was a division of labour between the expressive and the scientific, and he was essentially and this comes actually from Horkheimer and Adorno in Dialectic of Enlightenment, they argue that there's a logocentric religion of laws. And so what they're saying there is that the sciences and the scientific knowledge are basically treated like a religious system. Scientists are not really much different from high priests. In fact, I think they use that term. And the sciences persecute the non-scientific. Now, they're specifically using this because they're bemoaning the fact that Marxist theory doesn't really get read into the sciences like physics, chemistry, biology. And so they're bemoaning this. They're bemoaning the fact that all of the existing knowledge is preventing the revolution from taking place. So they want to undermine it. They want to be able to implement their Marxist ideas to socially engineer people's consciousness and change the way they behave, and to reform society and the relations between all of the institutions and the kind of the things that people would act in order to destroy, and the society that they would then create as a result of destroying the old society. Whereas in Horkheimer and Adorno's philosophy, they're not actually positing a known end like in Hegel or Marx. They're actually taking the dialectical process and severing it from that. So you destroy the existing society, but you don't necessarily know where you're going, but you just keep destroying, and ideally this moves you closer and closer towards some sort of sense of the truth and the ethical. Not the wisest, but hey, didn't stop them. So here, when you come to Derrida's philosophy, he likewise recapitulates that Horkheimer and Adorno idea of there being a logocentric religion of laws. So he applies Marx's theory of division of labour to language. So we can see how Derrida is taking up Althusser's call. Althusser was saying to the French intellectuals, you guys need to look at Gramsci's ideas and implement his project. And here we're seeing division of labour being applied to language itself. So you've got logical language versus the expressive language, which things like lived experience are tapping into. So the sanctity of childhood innocence functions as a definitive signifier of childhood. And what's being said there is that at a certain point in time, you've got a certain conception of childhood, and childhood innocence itself is a signifier of that. So this is actually more of a Derridian aspect than perhaps the Foucauldian discourses, though they're very closely related. So, the idea here is that there's an existing meaning, there's an existing word which represents that meaning. Here we're taking childhood innocence as a set of words to understand childhood innocence at a certain point in time. Now, if you're breaking that apart, what you're going to need to do is to reform the understanding of childhood innocence itself. So you don't necessarily get rid of the words, but you're going to change the meaning of those words. Now, crude rule of thumb, anything in the Marxist tradition is typically is the inversion of the natural world. So if you're looking here at what childhood innocence is going to be, then it's going to be inverted into the sexualization of children. It's the children having agency over their own sexuality, and so on and so forth. This is the truly innocent child in the dialectical framework, whereas the childhood innocence of the present day is the signifier of the oppressed child who cannot express their sexuality. So, while dispensing of the constraints of child protection may not be the ultimate answer to equalizing innocence, a decentering approach to childhood innocence offers a useful point of discussion. The first part of that is completely insane to me. I don't even know what to say, but this is the kind of stuff which is common within the queer theoretic framework. It's willing to dispense with the constraints of child protection in order to equalize innocence. I mean, I don't get how you could come up with any of this stuff, but so the decentering approach, that's the Derridian aspect. What you do is you say that childhood innocence, that is it's a concept which is itself a divisive void, and it's divisive because it's not immanent to material reality and being underpinned by the correct material relations and expression of those material relations and the sense of meaning that goes along with those material relations. So the existing concept is revealed to be just an abstract void which needs to be replaced by embodied contents. That's a significant part of Derrida's philosophy. Fundamentally, it's dialectical as well, so you're always in this process of going from the void to the populated, the immanent. So to queer innocence is to intentionally cultivate responsibility with children by inviting unanticipated events and thinking about something other than the discursive normalcies of childhood. Here we can see that Vygotskian proletarian child, and the idea here is that you intentionally cultivate responsibility, so you're inducing the child to respond to something by inviting unanticipated events and thinking about something other than the discursive normalcies of childhood. So you take the things which would have been abnormal in childhood. Here we're obviously talking about childhood innocence, so you're taking the things which are the opposite of the childhood innocence, and then you are getting the child to think about it. You are basing and creating events within the classroom or art which are based on the rejecting the normalcy of childhood, and the child in turn has to, practice something or think about something based on these inversions of childhood. And so you can quite clearly see here how you have the Derridian break of childhood innocence. You reform the contents of childhood innocence, the inversion of what we would understand, and then you place the ideas and actions and various things which can be created based on this new inverted idea of childhood innocence. You present it to the child and you get them to respond to it, and you make them amenable to response. So you train them to essentially react to the stimuli, or to divulge something in relation to the stimuli, and so on and so forth. And then Zaman and Anderson-Nath. So adults sustain the ideas of childhood innocence in order to maintain power in the relationship. This is, again, quite consistent with what we were seeing with Dyer, but it's also a recapitulation now of, the distinction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Now we actually have the adult and the child. So the adult is oppressing the child by maintaining power in the relationship. The way to remove oppression is thereby to redistribute power in the relationship. And obviously, as we've seen in the rest of this literature, you redistribute power and the autonomy and agency and ability to experience sexuality and sexual pleasure. So it's quite straightforward when they say that principles of normalcy, abnormality, and linear progression from immaturity to maturity are not often troubled. Queering developmentism offers an opportunity to expose and destabilize these principles. So here again we're seeing how queer developmentalism or queer pedagogy is explicitly juxtaposed and opposed to the typical means of development and childhood normalcy, so what we'd expect. So they call for a queering of developmentalist models. So what you're seeing here is then taking the Foucauldian ideas in queer theory and to then seed it into each of the different academic disciplines. So say, for example, you're studying psychology, you would expect to see childhood development studies now start to draw on dialectical philosophy, Foucauldian discourses, the Derridian approach to breaking words apart from their meaning and then repopulating them with new meaning, which is materialist and which is oriented towards the collapsing of distinctions, and which ensures that people's sense of meaning is associated with the attainment of a goal at a certain point in the future. And so you can queer the developmental models. So cognitive science would now have to be recapitulated through all these lenses. It would have to have a queer form. So you take all of the landscape of knowledge that all existing sciences and disciplinary areas have developed, you situate them as discourses, and then you say that each of those discourses, the contents of the discourses, the people who are responsible for populating the content of the discourse, the way that they populate the discourse contents, the way that people then communicate them with one another at a collective level, in different institutions in society, the way they express themselves, all of these now need to be dialectically reformed using the various processes which we've discussed throughout. So you obviously displace science with this false science of the dialectical philosophy. And that's fundamentally directed at changing childhood development models, so you're deliberately trying to create the queer youth. To develop this idea fully, we'll need to take a last look at Drag Queen Story Hour, which I've abbreviated as DQSH. So there's a couple last papers here. We're going to quickly touch back on Butler and then look at how drag is integrated into queer pedagogy and some of the implications. So Butler, if we recall, she talks about drag and how drag is a subversion of identity. So you're changing the way that people perform and conceive of themselves, and it's opposed to the dimorphic model of man and woman. So I would suggest that as well that drag fully subverts the distinction between inner and outer psychic space and effectively mocks both the expressive model of gender and the notion of a true gender identity. So here drag is a rejection, is part of that rejecting the sexual dimorphism, and that there are explicit identities contingent on sex. So it gives us a clue to the way in which the relationship between primary identification, that is, the original meanings accorded to gender, and subsequent gender experience might be reframed. So here, drag is explicitly a tool by which the old understanding of gender and gender practices can be undermined. And so, yes, drag here breaks heterosexual norms and establishes new behaviours. So when we come to Townsend's paper in 2019, we hear about something called Drag Queen Story Hour. And Drag Queen Story Hour is where a person dressed in drag goes to a library. I think the majority of these are scheduled in. And the person in drag goes along and they read to children. And it's supposedly, a learning program for literacy development. So, yeah, children are invited into a space with a drag queen, encouraged to engage with the gender performance. So this is important because it's not just being a voyeur. It's not just seeing something done and then not embodying it. The idea is that you've got to embody the praxis yourself. In order to then learn the behaviors, because in the Marxist framework, the way you conduct yourself, your actions, theories are abstractions from your action, or theories are mental representations of your action. And in order to have that mental representation, in order to embody and possess the raised consciousness, you must have gone through the actions. And so the gender performance, the child has got to partake in it, so they can't just watch. So the idea here is that the child, by embodying it, begins to establish their own corpus of lived experience in relation to a drag identity. And of course that drag identity is opposed to the dimorphic categories. So the emphasis here is on two mum and two dad picture books. What that just means is that the families themselves are queered. So you have, two people who are in the role of mum or two people who are in the role of dad, but it's not the heterosexual family, it's a queer family. And the idea, obviously, is that, this is the antithesis of what is the norm, which is the male and female coming together, because it's only they who can produce children. So Harper Keenan and Little Miss Hot Mess 2020. This is another paper. I'm going to presume that the person, Little Miss Hot Mess, is a drag queen. They're exploring drag pedagogy. So this is essentially queer. Well, this is queer pedagogy. Drag pedagogy being a specific manifestation of queer pedagogy. And so the process of learning is bidirectional. So, of course, now with the brief digression into Paulo Freire, you'll understand exactly what is meant by the fact that the process of learning is bidirectional. The teachers are also the students, and the students are also the teachers. So the children are also teaching the teachers how to indoctrinate them by how they respond to certain events and certain stimuli which are presented to them. And then likewise, the teachers learning from this perfect their methods. They can develop new materials or new things to put in front of the children, and this is more effective, or they learn more effective ways of bringing the children towards historicist ideas and dialectical ideas, here pertaining to the praxis and embodiment of queer and adopting the queer identity. And so what you see here is the idea that play as praxis. So here the term praxis itself is being reformed into play. So this is it's being adapted to the context of the child. Play is the set of behaviors, the set of procedural actions, and now the child through play has the theoretic representation of their various practices in the classroom. And so that can include aesthetic transformation. So that means changing the sense of beauty or the notions of beauty. That, of course, when we come back to Butler's idea that, or Foucault's idea rather, that the body is a surface on which power acts, the aesthetic transformation here is the transformation of the body. So that can be garments worn, that can be tattoos, the colour of hair, ornaments and things like this that are worn. Strategic defiance, so this is knowing what, when and where to resist. So teaching children to be very sensitive about what they resist and when and where and what's the right opportunity and what things to let go and what the right way to resist certain or to defy certain norms are. So of course here, the defiance may be outside of the view of the parents, for example, but in the view of in public, in amongst their peers. So you might not necessarily, as a parent, need to know that the defiance is taking place, but it is. But that's because part of the defiance is perhaps ensuring that you don't know about it. And this can also include the destigmatization of shame and embodied kinship. Well, I don't think the children really need that. Obviously, the destigmatization of shame means that certain behaviors which are obviously seen as outside the norm, as outside childhood innocence, they would then be destigmatized. So it's quite easy to see why they would then describe the drag queen story hour as reading each other to filth. Not something one would expect in the context of childhood and childhood innocence, but within queer theory and queer pedagogy, completely expected. So they positioning queer and transcultural forms as valuable components of early childhood education. Well, here we basically just see the entire process of queering the children from as early as possible, using every means available. So whether that's the dress code that the drag queen uses, to the way that they read, to the way that they conduct themselves, to the way that, to the certain ideas that they convey to the children of throwing off norms and rejecting authority and the past. Everything in education is dialectically reformed in order that the child's play, in order that the child's praxis is reoriented towards this goal in which their identity is diametrically opposed and existentially opposed to the sexual dimorphism of male and female. So continuing this paper, the intent is not merely to expose, but its contributions can run deeper than morals and role models. And the thing which is being got at here is that it's not just the way that you look at right and wrong and the people you want to emulate. Is it something fundamental about your identity, all about your sense of meaning? It needs to be something which is bringing the child's experience to this heightened level of life and experience, which they haven't had before, and through this to start to cultivate collective bonds between those teachers and that groups and the children. So we can see how certain stimuli are placed into the children's field of vision. That's actually a quote from Hitler. But certain things are placed into the field of vision of the people who are to be manipulated. And this is, as we said, inducing changes in their consciousness. And it induces thereby changes in the way they behave, changes in their verbal practices, their theories, so on and so forth. But the idea is it becomes a fundamental aspect of their nature, so that after that, once you begin to embody it, anyone's rejection of that embodying, that lived experience, becomes the rejection, the negation of their actual being. So it has to be accepted at every point thereafter. And it's so fundamental that it needs to be seen as central to their identity, as Foucault had argued. So ultimately has no rules. Its defining quality is often to break as many rules as possible. Well, not surprised with that. That comes straight from Foucault. We can see how that graphs onto his idea of trying to reinstate the perversions back into society. Here it's obviously taking place through the education of children. There's a premium on standing out, on artfully desecrating the sacred. So the premium on standing out is the aesthetic aspect. That's the decoration, the kind of the peacocking. You know, you've got to dress up glamorously. You essentially take on the drag garb and you recapitulate drag life. And then artfully desecrating the sacred. So it's this aspect where you're taking things which were previously seen as you instead take an irreverent approach to the old society that existed around you. And the art form is, on the one hand, the things that you produce and the things that you create in society, but the surface, or the art form, or the art surface, is often the body, as was previously stated. And so obviously, again, they suggest strategic defiance, and then they talk about campy drag aesthetics, so destigmatize shame by placing the joke on society. So this is again one of the typical inversions that you'll often see within the Marxist and neo-Marxist and post-structuralist frameworks, is that you conduct yourself in a way, you do something, and that thing is a provocation to the people that the Marxists want to overthrow. And what you do is you then use that to make them look irrational. You use that to, and then you place the joke on them. So the campy drag aesthetics, you do something which is seen as abhorrent, as against childhood innocence. You say that it's not shameful. You say you associate everything positive with it, and then you make the joke on society. At worst, existing society is being cruel and oppressive. But at best, they're seen as overreacting. Oh, you can't take a joke. Oh, you're not very sociable like that, are you? Can't you just see we're playing? And all these kind of ideas. And then, of course, quote, encourages kids to move their hips in ways often coded as effeminate. So, of course, this is getting children to now undertake the praxis of the drag queen, or as they would say, getting the children to engage in play. So play now for the children through the dialectical framework involves the children moving their body in ways that you would normally expect at an adult show, or which might be effeminate. So this is essentially sexually alluring behavior being taught to children is the long and short of it. I mean, yeah. So they continue and they state that the queer pedagogy, drag queen story hour is collectivist. So queer praxis breaks the limiting stereotypes of a teacher, encourages children to think for themselves and even to break the rules. So breaking the rules, nothing new. The breaking the stereotype of the teacher, that can have several levels. That's the way that the teacher dresses, the way they present themselves, the way they conduct a lesson. The teacher in that environment, after Paulo Freire's developments, you might actually see them saying, oh, I want you children to read me the story. I want you to teach me something. So you've got the inversion at various different points that can manifest itself in different ways. But fundamentally, the queer praxis, the queer play, is that it breaks the old understanding and gets the children to basically become the center of their own agency, so to think for themselves and to break the rules. So, the right conduct is to break the rules, not to learn it. But of course, you're not likely to learn the consequences of breaking those rules or becoming a habitual rule breaker, and then the consequences for society. And of course, the consequences for society are, you can look to Marxist civilizations for the consequences. So it artfully invites children into building communities that are more hospitable to queer knowledge and experience. So again, this is the academics have created this receptacle. It's the queer child. So you need to summon forth the queer children through queer pedagogy. So you reject the notion of childhood innocence. This is, of course, a barrier towards their new form of development. So you reject the linear development from childhood into adulthood through various stages which are associated with cognitive developments, pubertal developments, and so on and so forth. And you instead say that the child is dialectical with their consciousness, so their development is contingent on what stimuli are placed in front of them. And of course, if you place in front of them the notion that they can be more mature, that they are more mature than they have experience for, that they are taking part in the building of this new higher society, which is kind and queer, and there's new knowledges and new experience that they can all engage with one another, and it's all really positive. That's what's being inculcated to the children. And likewise, we see again the same idea of rejecting the existing society by fostering collective unruliness. So it's the process that the queer is a group which is unruly, it's defiant, it's rejecting the old system, the old society, the old institutions, the old praxis, the old play, and all of these different aspects. But again, we're seeing how the identity is actually something which is being deliberately created as something antagonistic to existing identities in society. And here was actually quite a nice discovery. So they explicitly state agreement with many of the original aims of Marx and Engels. So within the historical context of the United States of America and Western Europe, the institutional management of gender has been used as a way of maintaining racist and capitalist modes of reproduction. So what we're saying here, again, is the sequence of historical epochs within the Western world, and that the previous use of sex being the origin of gender has been one of the ways of sustaining racism in the Western world and capitalism in the Western world. So we're seeing how the discourses after Foucault are being used to maintain highly negative things from the Marxist perspective. Well, racism is negative from everyone's perspective, but sustaining the capitalism. And so what you're seeing here is that gender bolts back into the division of labour. Well, surprise, surprise, where does that come from? Now, gender normativity works to maintain the larger structures that facilitate its production, coloniality and racial capitalism. So the ideas here are that the gender norms, so this is the male and female, the masculine and the feminine, and the idea that men typically go out and they're the breadwinner, whilst woman will stay at home, look after the children and raise the children, look after the home and potentially have a side job. These gender norms, they are bolted into coloniality and racial capitalism. So this is the exploitation of the rest of the world by Western nations and their ideas, their modes of production, their systems of private property, and so on and so forth. So what you're seeing here is not just the notion of redistribution within a nation, you're seeing the notion of international redistribution being developed. This line of thought you can see more in Jacques Derrida's philosophy, and also through the philosophy of Gayatri Spivak, but not necessarily going to touch on it here. But you can obviously just see how essentially the dialectical process of reflection, you just associate the things that you don't like with all of the other things that you want to get rid of. So here the sex norms and then the gender norms would take part in colonial oppression of other nations and other races. So drag serves to make revolution irresistible. We can see here how this integration of strategic defiance and challenging and breaking norms is essentially the early play manifestation of the revolutionary process for the subaltern classes. So here we're talking about the child subaltern class versus the adult bourgeois class of the old society. So whilst they're partaking in drag, they're obviously breaking down the ideas of distinctions between the sexes, between the genders. They're breaking down the distinctions between hetero and homosexuality, and you end up in this just kind of melange of God knows what's happening. There's a whole bunch of stuff and new linguistic redescriptions, and there's the integration of all of the perversions and things like this. But it begins at a young age with the habitual praxis of rejecting authority, of rejecting existing norms. And so the child becomes the proletarian child. They embody the revolutionary process, and all aspect and manifestation of their life is to effect the revolution. So Drag Queen Story Hour offers a queer relationality with children that breaks from the reproductive futurity of the normative classroom and nuclear family. Oh, I struggled to get through that one. So yeah, Drag Queen Story Hour, it's a means by which you establish new relationships, new collectives, and you're essentially trying to displace the process whereby they then take part in the normal classroom and the nuclear family. So you're breaking apart the form of the family. And at this point, we've come full circle back to Marx and Engels. And we can see how now queer theory, coming from Foucault's developments, but Foucault's way of shifting the Marxist approach to a slightly different one, shifting from structuralism to discourses, we can see how here the core Marxist idea, methodology, really manifests itself again despite the passage of well over a century. So queer world making, including political organising, has long been a project driven by desire. So we can see how not only is the set of desires and pleasures and practices in Foucault for realising a new form of sexuality and new forms of knowledge, but it's actually bolted into the same process of realising the revolution. So there's a sexual joy in bringing the revolution. What that necessarily means in terms of the biological motives for revolution and removal of competition or being able to use force in order to find spouses and people to sleep with, I'm not entirely sure, but it's probably something that needs to be investigated. And they finally leave with a statement that we're leaving a trail of glitter that won't ever come out of the carpet. So again, this is the idea that it becomes so core to their understanding and identity that it's bolted dialectically into their morals, their understanding of the world, their understanding of science, their understanding of right and wrong, how they should conduct themselves, what their purpose in life is. You know, it really becomes a system which completely takes over their entire life and which changes every view and understanding and perception of existence itself. It completely reforms it. It completely turns everything on its head. And the idea is that this is explicitly designed so that it's going to be a permanent change. So a permanent overthrow of the sexual norms, of the exclusion of the perversions, of the nuclear family within Western nations, an overthrow of capitalism and coloniality, and so on and so forth, of childhood innocence and so on and so forth. They explicitly say that their framework is anti-realist, and so it's this process of, you know, coming to consciousness and then refashioning yourself. And obviously, as different stimuli come into your life, then you're supposed to respond to them. And obviously, if it's dialectical philosophy and dialectical ideas, then you need to, you know, very quickly respond to them, adopt that into your consciousness and your practices. So you're always being reformed by the collective around you. So play is praxis and play is power. That's what really underpins this. You know, it's the manifestation of social relations and power through each of the actions that you partake in. And one of the things which the play reveals, which the power actions, the actions and power manifested through those actions reveals, is the contradiction between the pedagogue and student. So this is, again, Paulo Freire's ideas. By taking part in play, it reveals the consciousness of the person, so you can have them reflect one another. Now, if you go and read Giovanni Gentili's book on the doctrine of Italian fascism, you will find a part where he describes how the duty of the teacher is to have the child reflect their consciousness. And so the teacher in Gentili's framework is in a higher stage of consciousness. They're aware of the goal of the future, the role of the state, and the purpose and duty of the person within the state. And so they are to induce the child to reflect their consciousness, to make the child like them, the adult. Now, in Paulo Freire's system, you've got differences, you've got a collapse of distinctions between the teacher and the adult, like in Giovanni Gentili's framework. But instead of, whereas in Gentili's framework, the child is being pulled towards a known end, in Freire's framework, the child and the teacher are supposed to become a democratic union who themselves create new knowledge. And so what happens is that when the teacher presents something or acts in a certain way and influences the child's consciousness, they're trying to reveal the child's consciousness to them in order to then get the child to better reflect the adult's consciousness. And it ultimately is a reflection of the adult's consciousness, because the adult is in the position of authority. They're dictating the use of the dialectical method, the historicism, the play and the praxis, the rejection of norms, and the embodiment of dialectical consciousness, praxis, revolutionary ideas and theory, and so on and so forth. So this really is a process of making the children malleable and responsive to revolutionary philosophy. Praxis becomes pleasure, so it's the ecstasy of destruction. I mean, this really is a core idea in Marxism, the creative destruction, but the critique, which is to destroy and supplant, is governed by pleasure. That's straight out of Marx. And you turn the rejections into desires. So if you are rejected, then you make that the center of your desire. The things which are rejected, you begin to desire. So again, collapse of contradictions, that's the process of inclusion. So, and lastly, engaging with the risks and pleasures of modifying and being modified by the world. Again, this is the dialectical process of you modify the collective, and the collective modifies you with your specific lived experience. So this is the Freirean approach to pedagogy, but now augmented with queer pedagogy. The last paper that we're going to explore is a short one, so it's Helkenberg and Chabot. And one of the recognitions is that once you start to implement this stuff in schools, people are going to disagree with it. There's going to be blowback, reaction, backlash. And so their paper is investigating what happens or how to respond when this backlash occurs. And so they recognize that the existing society, as it is, rejects the idea that childhood innocence should be inverted and that children should be queered, that children should have to undergo queer pedagogy and queer developmentalism in order to induce them into rejecting the norms and establishing a praxis of inclusion whilst also tearing down established norms. So people who reject this, whether it's an intellectual rejection, whether it's an emotional rejection, these can be framed as backlash. This can easily tap into the victimhood aspect of the identity. That's the bog standard fallback position, is to go back to the fact that the identity is being constructed as victimhood. Oh, these people are victims. If you reject it, then it's a rejection of their fundamental being. It's oppressive. Ultimately, it's violent. It induces them to harm themselves, to commit suicide. So any kind of rejection whatsoever is inherently wrong. Of course, you can see how this stems from Butler's notion that negotiation is contingent on the positions of power. So, of course, where the new identities are in a position inferior, they need to be given special power and special privileges in order to counteract the power that other groups are simply labelled as having over them. And so one of the things here is to position drag queen story hour and queer pedagogy as intellectual freedom. This is a very typical Marxist approach, which is it always bifurcates. So you use the established ideas in the existing society against itself, whilst always working towards the revolution. So say, for example, you exist in a society which has freedom of speech. You always advocate the requirement for freedom of speech for Marxist ideas. So you're using the values of liberalism and problem solving against those people who would reject Marxist ideas. So you're using their own values against them, whilst at the same time using precisely the exact same framework to advance Marxist ideas, which ultimately would then depose and destroy those people which you're using the claim of intellectual freedom against. So you can see how there's this bifurcation. You use the values of the existing society against those people, whilst at the same time with the other hand, you explicitly subvert and seek to depose them. Now, this presents quite a challenge when it comes to overturning these ideas. The first step really is in understanding what are the ideas in their totality, and what this lecture and especially the previous lecture have demonstrated is what the intellectual background, thinking processes, motivations, contents and goals are of this system. So the claim of intellectual freedom as it pertains to queer pedagogy or drag queen story hour would likely be defended using the victimhood aspects and the violence aspects in conjunction with the need for intellectual freedom. However, when we recognise that as far as Foucault was concerned, what you do is you situate everything as a series of discourses and you reject the old, and then you establish new discourses. These new discourses are the basis of truth, and political action should only take place on that basis of truth. Then this system is not looking at all towards intellectual freedom. It's actually a system which is using intellectual freedom in order to depose intellectual freedom. And so it's recognizing that movement that is important to rejecting these ideas being taught openly in school, because it's not the provision of this framework alongside the old framework, it's the provision of an identity which is categorically opposed and is stated as being intrinsically oppressed by the existing categories. So it becomes steadily impossible for people to occupy those old categories because they, due to the framework, are simply defined as being cruel, oppressive, so on and so forth. So when it comes to intellectual investigation, that might be appropriate for Marxist intellectuals in academies if nations want to tolerate Marxist intellectuals in their academies who are ultimately working towards the international revolution, which would involve the sedition and treason against their state and government, and then the collapse of the national borders in order to realise the international state. So if a nation's going to have those and pay them, that's fine. That will be up to them, and they can reap the consequences of that. Obviously, recognising that this entire framework is part of a revolutionary process is one of the means of fighting back against the claim of intellectual freedom. It's not intellectual freedom when you seek to establish a totalising hegemony which permeates every aspect of life. And the co-option of people's children into that process is likewise something that parents can reject. And likewise, if the state begins to partake in this, then likewise people can reject the state imposing this system on their children and having them pay taxes for the indoctrination of their own children. And so what you typically see is that they have their arguments laid out. So the role of the library is to promote intellectual freedom. They need to combine this intellectual freedom with their social engineering goals, but their social engineering goals are directed by academic discourses on victimhood. So they're always positive, but those academic discourses are ultimately from the Marxist tradition. And so it's recognising that it's totalitarianism using the claim of intellectual freedom in order to advance totalitarian ideas that should serve as the basis for making decisions on the content and whether it's taught in schools or whether it's forbidden. And if it is taught in schools, then that society will have to reap the consequences. Summary. So there's been a lot in this one. We've looked at Foucault's ideas from archaeology of knowledge and history of sexuality in the previous lecture, but now we've unfolded how they've been applied. So there's a huge influence on identity and lived experience. The notion of sexual class consciousness, we see that coming through all of this lecture. The role of the discourses, which is law, pedagogy, criminology, and how the more recent queer pedagogy ideas bolt into collectivization, and then the original Marxist project. And we see it come full circle, and we see how every aspect it is intrinsically political, rejects the norms, it rejects reality, and it instead opts for dialectical philosophy and the ability to constantly reform reality. Realistically, these are all rhetorical games, but rhetorical games nonetheless have severe consequences for society, especially where we dispose of the idea of objective facts and objective reality. So the works cited for the various parts are here. So thank you for joining me for lecture 3 of 4. In the next one, I'm instead going to look at how some of these ideas make their movement from academia into government policy. So we've obviously covered a lot of how this can enter into academia, into teaching, into different academic disciplines. now it's important to actually see a clear example of where these ideas are manifested in policy and in the education system, and then how they can influence the constitution of law. Thank you.